The morning Colt Mercer walked into Hazel Rowan's shop for the first time, he wasn't looking for anything in particular. That was the honest truth of it, though he would later have a hard time explaining it to anyone who asked. He wasn't looking for a seamstress exactly. He had a tear in his work jacket, yes, but it was a small tear, the kind of thing a man in his position could have ignored for another 3 weeks without anyone noticing or caring. He wasn't looking for conversation. He'd had plenty of that the night before at the Silver Horn Saloon, where men clapped him on the back and women laughed a little too loud at things he said that weren't particularly funny. He wasn't looking for a reason to stay in one place longer than necessary, because Colt Mercer, as anyone in Black Ridge would tell you, was not a man who stayed anywhere longer than necessary. But he walked into the shop. He would think about that later. The strange, ordinary pull of a door with a small bell above it and a hand-painted sign that read Rowan's Mending and Alterations, the letters slightly uneven, the R a little bigger than the rest. He walked in because the door was there, and he wasn't in any particular hurry, and sometimes a man makes a decision that changes the direction of his entire life because he happened to be walking on the right side of the street. The shop was narrow. That was the first thing he noticed. It had been wedged into the space between the hardware store and an empty building that used to be a bootmaker's, and it felt like the town had forgotten to leave enough room for it. Shelves ran along one wall holding bolts of fabric, cotton mostly, some wool, a few yards of something dark green that looked softer than the rest. A work table ran down the center of the room, and at the far end of it, near the window that let in the only real light in the place, sat Hazel Rowan. She didn't look up when he came in. She was working on something. A man's shirt, it looked like, spread flat across the table while her needle moved through the fabric in a steady, unhurried rhythm. Her hair was dark brown and pulled back in a way that was practical rather than pretty, pinned up at the back of her neck with what looked like 2 pencils. She wore a plain gray dress with an ink stain near the cuff of the right sleeve that she clearly hadn't bothered to address. She was not beautiful in any way that the town of Black Ridge would have recognized or rewarded. She was simply a woman doing her work, and she was doing it with the kind of focused attention that made the rest of the world temporarily irrelevant. "Be with you in a minute," she said, without looking up. Colt stood near the door. He took off his hat. He didn't know why he took his hat off. He hadn't done that when he'd walked into the hardware store that morning, and Ed Calloway had been standing right behind the counter, full face forward. Something about the quality of the room, maybe, or the quality of the silence. "No rush," he said. She finished what she was doing. He could see she was reinforcing a buttonhole, tiny stitches looping around the edge, and set the shirt aside. Then she looked up, and her eyes were gray-green, the kind of color that changed depending on the light, and they looked at him with a directness that he wasn't quite used to. "Colt Mercer," she said. It wasn't a question, and it wasn't particularly warm. It was just the fact of him, acknowledged. "That's right." He glanced down at the jacket in his hand. "I've got a tear along the shoulder seam. Happened last week and I've been meaning to bring it in." She held out her hand without getting up, and he crossed the room and gave her the jacket. She turned it over, found the tear, ran her thumb along the separation in the fabric to see how far it went, and nodded once. 2 days, she said. "Come back Thursday." "I was hoping sooner," he said. She looked up at him again. "I have 4 orders ahead of you, Mr. Mercer. I'll pay extra." "I know you will," she said. "Still Thursday." He did come back Thursday, and then he came back the following week without anything in particular that needed mending. He wasn't entirely sure what he was doing. He told himself he was just passing through that part of town on his way to somewhere else, which was not entirely a lie, but not entirely the truth either. He stayed for 20 minutes the second time, sitting on the wooden stool near the door while Hazel worked, and they talked in the disjointed, surface-level way of people who don't know each other well. The weather, the condition of the North Road after the recent rains, a story he'd heard about one of the ranch hands out at the Dunmore place doing something stupid with a fence post. Hazel contributed to the conversation in brief, precise sentences. She didn't fill silences. She didn't perform interest she didn't feel. When something struck her as worth responding to, she responded to it. When it didn't, she simply kept working, and the needle kept moving, and the silence sat between them without weight. He found himself thinking about that afterward, the silence without weight. Every other room he walked into in Black Ridge, silence was a problem to be solved. At the Silverhorn, silence meant nobody liked your joke. At the Dunmore Ranch, where he'd been buying stock for 3 years, silence from old Porter Dunmore meant a deal was about to go sideways. At the Weston House, and he thought of the Weston House with the particular discomfort of a man who has been clearly pursued by someone he cannot figure out how to discourage. Silence meant Helena Weston was calculating her next approach. In Hazel's shop, silence meant she was working, and he was there, and neither of those things was a problem. He came back a third time the week after that. Well, Blackridge noticed on the third visit, or rather, Marta Cleve noticed, which amounted to the same thing. Marta ran the dry goods store 3 doors down and had the particular gift of being able to observe an event, assign it a meaning, and distribute that meaning to 12 other people, all before the event had properly finished occurring. She saw Colt Mercer's horse tied out front of Rowan's Mending on a Tuesday afternoon, which was not market day or any other day that made sense for a man like Colt to be in that part of town. She saw it there for the better part of an hour. She put that together with the fact that she'd heard from Dolly Ferris, who'd heard from someone else, that Colt had been seen going in there before, and she started talking. By Wednesday, the story had taken a shape. Colt heard it Friday from his ranch hand Deke, who told it the way Deke told everything, sideways with a kind of studied casualness, like he was just mentioning a thing he'd happened to overhear and wasn't particularly invested in. "People are saying you've been spending time over at the seamstress shop," Deke said. They were mending the eastern fence line, which had taken some damage in the last storm, and Deke was working the wire while Colt held the post. "The Rowan woman." "I have been," Colt said. Deke glanced at him. "Just, people are wondering is all." "Let them wonder." "Helena Weston is apparently real unhappy about it." A pause. "And her father?" Colt set the post and stood up straight. "Douglas Weston doesn't have anything to say about where I spend my time." "He's got money, though," Deke said. "Not meanly, just factually. And he's been, the way he talks around town. It's like he thinks it's already decided, that you and Helena are already decided." "Well, it's not." Deke went back to the wire. "I know that. I'm just telling you what people are saying." What people were saying, when you stripped away the polite language and the sideways glances, was that Colt Mercer was making a mistake. And not a small, correctable mistake, a fundamental, character-revealing mistake, the kind that told you something true about a man that you might not have known before. Blackridge had a clear hierarchy, the kind that didn't need to be written down because everyone already knew it and enforced it daily through 100 small signals. At the top were the families with land and money, the Westons, the Hales, the Aldriches. Below them were the merchants and professionals who kept things running, then the workers and the hands. And then, at the edges, the people who existed in the spaces the town left over, the ones who were useful but not important, visible but not seen. Hazel Rowan was at the edges. She had come to Blackridge 4 years ago from somewhere nobody quite remembered, with a sewing machine and a small amount of money and very little else. She'd rented the narrow shop and started working, and the town had allowed her existence in the way that towns allow the existence of necessary services, with the absent, uncomplicated acceptance you'd give a water pump. You were glad it was there. You didn't think about it. She wasn't disliked exactly. It was more that she didn't fit cleanly into any of the categories that made a person interesting. She wasn't beautiful enough to attract the attention that sometimes elevated a woman's position. She wasn't connected to anyone who mattered. She didn't go to the social functions, not the church suppers, not the dances at the Aldrich barn, not the monthly meetings of the Ladies' Improvement Society, which had made exactly one attempt to recruit her and accepted her quiet refusal with the relief of people who hadn't really expected her to fit in anyway. She was just there, working, quiet. And now Colt Mercer, who could have had Helena Weston and the Weston land and the Weston money and everything that came with that, who could have married his way into a position that would have set him and his children and his children's children up for generations, was sitting on a stool in that woman's narrow shop and talking to her about the North Road. People couldn't entirely make sense of it, and when people can't make sense of something, they generally decide it reflects poorly on whoever is doing the incomprehensible thing. Hazel was aware of the talk. Of course. She had always been aware of the talk, in the peripheral, practical way of a person who has learned to register what is being said about her, without letting it occupy too much of her attention. She heard it in the way Marta Cleave's conversation died slightly when she came into the dry goods store. She saw it in the way two women on the main street turned to each other and exchanged something brief and charged when they saw her. She felt it in the particular quality of the silence at the post office one morning when she came in for her mail and three people were there who all suddenly became very interested in their own envelopes. She had lived with this for 4 years. She knew its texture. What was different now was that Colt Mercer was in the middle of it, and he didn't seem to notice, or noticing, didn't seem to care, which was, she turned this over in her mind during the quiet evenings in her back room, while she did the finish work too detailed to rush, either admirable or simply oblivious, and she hadn't yet determined which. He came in on a Thursday that was 3 weeks into what the town had decided to call, with various degrees of disapproval, the situation. She heard the bell. She knew it was him by the sound of the boots. He had a particular unhurried step, heavier on the left, which she'd noticed early on. She didn't look up from the collar she was resetting. "You're becoming a regular," she said. "I am," he agreed. He settled onto the stool. He'd started, without asking or being invited, to simply sit on the stool as though it were established practice. She'd thought about saying something about that and had decided it wasn't worth the conversation. "Does that bother you?" he asked. She considered it honestly. "Not particularly." "Good." He was quiet for a moment, then, "I heard Douglas Weston had words with my foreman yesterday." Her hand stilled for just a moment on the fabric. Then she kept working. "What kind of words?" "The kind that are meant to reach me without coming directly from him." He didn't sound angry, exactly. More like a man reporting a weather condition, something that had happened that would need to be dealt with but wasn't a surprise. "Apparently I'm making poor decisions with my social calendar." "That's diplomatic," Hazel said. "Deke cleaned it up for me," Colt admitted. She set the collar down and looked at him properly. There was something she needed to say, and she was going to say it plainly, because she had never been able to afford the luxury of saying things indirectly. "You should think carefully about this," she said, "whatever it is you think you're doing." "I know what I'm doing." "Do you?" It wasn't a challenge, just a question, genuinely asked. He looked at her, that straight, unhurried look she'd seen from the first day, the one that didn't soften or dart away or do any of the things men's eyes usually did when they were looking at something they weren't sure how to categorize. "I'm spending time with a person I find worth spending time with," he said. "I don't think that requires more analysis than that." "It does, actually." She folded her hands in her lap. "Because what you do with your time has consequences for both of us. For you, it means you lose whatever chance you had with the Westons and anyone who thinks the way they do. That's real money, Colt, real land, real future. I know what I'm giving up. And for me," she continued, as though he hadn't spoken, "it means that whatever small amount of neutrality I've managed to build in this town disappears. The people who've been ignoring me start actively disliking me. The people who were mildly kind start finding reasons to take their mending elsewhere." She paused. "I have a business to run. I need customers to survive." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse went by on the main street, and someone called a name, and then the street was quiet again. "Are you asking me to stop coming?" he said. She thought about it. That was the honest thing. She actually thought about it, sitting there with her hands folded, because she was a woman who had always tried to make decisions based on what was actually true rather than what she wished were true. What was true was that she had not had a conversation this real with anyone in 4 years. What was true was that something about his presence in the shop, the uncomplicated fact of it, the refusal to treat her as invisible, had made something in her relax that she hadn't known was braced. What was true was that she was 31 years old and she was tired, bone-tired, of being at the edges. "No," she said finally, "I'm not asking you to stop." He nodded once, as though something had been settled. "But I want you to understand the math," she said. "That's all. I want to make sure you're not doing this because you've decided I'm a project or a cause, because I have no patience for that." Something shifted in his expression. Not offense exactly, but a slight recalibration, like a man who's just learned he's been looking at a map at the wrong scale. "Is that what you think this is?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "That's why I'm telling you." The problem with Colt Mercer, Hazel would later reflect, was that he was not what the town thought he was, but he was also not entirely what he thought he was, which made him more interesting and more complicated than either version. What the town thought: a successful rancher, moderately prosperous, good-looking in a weather-worn way, reliable at paying his debts and keeping his word, a safe choice for any woman with eyes and sense. A man who would eventually make the obvious practical decision, the Weston girl, or someone like her, and settle into the kind of life that the town could recognize and approve of. What he thought of himself. Harder to say, because Colt was not a man who spent a great deal of time on that kind of introspection, not out of lack of intelligence, but out of a particular practical orientation that said you dealt with what was in front of you and didn't spend too much time theorizing about the shape of your own character, what he actually was. And this Hazel assembled slowly, over weeks of those Thursday conversations, and the occasional other day when he found a reason to pass by, was a man who had grown up in a family that didn't have money, who had built what he had through 15 years of physical work and careful management, and who had therefore developed a very accurate eye for what was solid versus what was show. He knew the difference, in a horse, between one that looked impressive in the yard and one that would hold up over 20 miles of rough terrain. He knew the difference, in a fence line, between one that had been built right and one that had been built to look right until the first serious storm. He had spent years around people who had a great deal of money and who were mostly performing a version of confidence that didn't have much behind it, and he had developed a specific impatience for performance. Hazel didn't perform. That was the thing. She was just herself, in a way that he found, the more time he spent in the shop, increasingly rare and increasingly valuable. She didn't edit what she said to make it more agreeable. She didn't try to make herself seem more important than she was. She had opinions, clearly formed and clearly expressed, and she was willing to be wrong about them if you gave her a reason, and she didn't take it personally if you disagreed. She was smart, though she didn't announce it. This was the thing about her that came through most gradually: the intelligence. It wasn't the kind that showed up in conversation as a performance, as a series of clever remarks designed to impress. It was more structural. She saw patterns, she noticed things, she filed information away and connected it to other information in ways that produced insights that were less like revelations and more like, yes, of course, obviously. How did I not see that? He found this out one afternoon when he mentioned, offhandedly, the trouble with the drought, which had been tightening its grip on the valley for going on 2 months now, long enough that people were starting to look at their water sources with genuine concern, and she said something that stopped him mid-sentence. "The Aldrich well hasn't been affected," she said. He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "George Aldrich's wife was in here 2 weeks ago. She mentioned in passing that they'd been watering their kitchen garden every day. She didn't look up from her work. If their well were running low, she wouldn't be doing that." He turned this over. The Aldrich well was on the northeast edge of the valley, in a position that, depending on where the drought was hitting hardest, might or might not explain the difference. But George Aldrich had been at the ranchers' meeting last week and said nothing about having water to spare, while 3 other ranchers talked about their shortages. It wasn't a large thing. It was probably nothing. But it was the kind of small observation that, if you put it next to other small observations, sometimes told you something worth knowing. "You notice things," he said. "People talk around me like I'm furniture," she said. It was not said with bitterness. It was matter of fact. After a while, you hear a lot. It was the 3rd week of July when the first cattle disappeared. Not from Colt's ranch, not at first. From the Pryor place, 8 miles east, where a rancher named Cal Pryor ran a mid-sized operation and was generally considered careful and competent. He lost 11 head overnight between a Thursday evening count and a Friday morning that turned up an empty section of pasture and a fence that had been cut cleanly and restrung with some care to make it look intact from a distance. The story was around town by Saturday. By the following week, it had happened again. This time to the Sanderson Ranch south of Pryor, 9 head, same clean cut and restring method. People started talking about outlaws. There had been stories, vague and unlocatable, about a group operating out of the mountains to the north. Men who knew the territory, who moved fast, who were gone before anyone could organize a proper response. The stories got bigger and more detailed as they traveled, the way stories do when people need a shape to put on their fear. Colt listened to the stories and didn't say much. He had his own concerns, his own herd, his own fences, his own operation to protect. But he also had, somewhere in the back of his mind, the quiet persistence of the observation Hazel had made about the Aldrich well, and a feeling he couldn't quite name that said, "Wait. Look again." He went to Hazel's shop on a Thursday, 9 days after the Sanderson theft, and he didn't sit on the stool. He stood near the work table with his hat in his hands, and he said, "Tell me what you know about the cattle thefts." She looked up at him with an expression that said she'd been wondering when he'd ask. "Sit down," she said. "This might take a minute." What she knew was not dramatic. It was not a list of evidence or a solved puzzle. It was, instead, a collection of details that she had accumulated in the way she accumulated everything, through the background attention of a person who has learned that information is one of the few reliable resources available to someone without money or status. She knew that Marcus Webb, who was foreman out at the Hale Ranch, had been in to pick up a repaired saddlebag 3 weeks before the first theft, and he had been unusually flushed and distracted in a way she'd filed away without knowing why. She knew that Dolly Ferris had mentioned, in passing, that Victor Hale's operation had lost no cattle at all, not a single head, while every other major ranch in the valley had either been hit or was on edge. She knew that a man she'd seen twice before, a man she didn't know by name, had ridden slowly past her shop on 2 consecutive evenings last week, which could be nothing, and which she would have treated as nothing except for the specificity of it. Same man, same horse, same deliberate pace, same long look at the building. She laid all of this out for Colt in the same tone she used for everything. Precise, unhurried, without ornamentation. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, the shop was very quiet. Outside, someone was loading something heavy onto a wagon, and the sound of it came through the thin walls, the grunt and thud of real physical work, and then faded. "You're saying you think it's inside," he said. "I'm saying the evidence is consistent with that. I'm not saying it's certain." She met his eyes. Victor Hale's operation is the largest in the valley. He has the connections to move cattle out of the territory without attracting attention. He has the money to hire people who know how to do this quietly. A pause. "And he hasn't lost a single head." "That could be luck," Colt said, "or better fences." "It could be," she agreed, "but his foreman was nervous 3 weeks before the first theft, and that man has ridden past this building twice in the last week." She let that sit. "I don't know why Victor Hale's foreman would be interested in a seamstress shop unless someone told him to keep an eye on it." Colt stared at her. "Why would anyone be watching you?" She looked at him steadily. "Because I notice things," she said, "and maybe someone has figured that out." He did not go straight home after that conversation. He rode out past the edge of town to where the land opened up and the mountains to the north were a dark line against the late afternoon sky. And he sat on his horse for a while in the particular way of a man who is trying to figure out what he's actually dealing with. The thing about Victor Hale was that he wasn't a man you made accusations against lightly. Victor Hale was 61 years old and had been in the territory for 30 years, which was long enough to have his name on half the buildings in Black Ridge in the form of donations and dedications. He employed a significant portion of the valley's working men. He had a standing friendship with the county sheriff that was visible enough to be intended as visible. He was, by any measure anyone in Black Ridge applied, a pillar. Pillars didn't organize cattle theft rings. Except, and this was the thought Colt kept coming back to, sitting on his horse with the wind coming off the mountains, except that someone was. 11 head from Pryor, 9 from Sanderson, rumors of losses from 2 other ranches he hadn't verified yet. That was 20 cattle minimum, worth real money, disappeared with a kind of professional efficiency that didn't suggest opportunistic outlaws. That suggested organization. And Victor Hale was, whatever else you said about him, organized. Colt turned his horse back toward town. He had some fence riding to do before dark, and 3 hands who needed their week's instructions, and a ranch that required his presence and his attention. He would turn all of this over in his mind for a few days. He would be careful. He thought, briefly, about telling Hazel to be careful too, to be less visible somehow, to give the impression that she hadn't noticed the things she'd noticed. But he already knew, from 3 months of Thursday conversations, that Hazel Rowan was not a woman who modified her behavior to manage other people's comfort or suspicion. She would do what she thought was right, and she would accept the consequences with the same steady practicality she brought to everything else. He admired that. He also, not for the first time, found it slightly terrifying. July gave way to August, and the drought did not break. The creek at the southern edge of Colt's property dropped another 6 inches. He moved cattle off the lower pastures and consolidated the herd in the northern section where the grass was still holding. He watched the sky every morning with the particular calculating attention of a man who has learned not to hope too hard for rain. In town, the talk shifted. The cattle thefts continued. 3 more incidents, more ranches, more losses. The story about mountain outlaws had grown elaborate and geographically imprecise, involving a camp somewhere in the high country to the north. A leader with various alarming characteristics, a network of receivers further east who moved the stolen stock across the state line. People told it with confidence. Nobody had any evidence for any of it. Nobody, except Hazel, was looking at the ground level. She told Colt, on a Thursday in the second week of August, that Marcus Webb, Victor Hale's foreman, had been in again to pick up a restitched collar, and that he had paid with coins that were recently minted, unusually new, the kind of coins you got from a bank rather than from accumulating work wages over time. She told him that she'd heard from the woman who did the Hale household's laundry that there had been a significant number of strangers at the Hale Main Ranch in the last month. Riders who came and went at odd hours, who weren't recognized as regular hands. She told him she'd seen the man on the horse a 3rd time. That one landed differently. "Same man?" Colt asked. "Same horse," she said. "Distinctive blaze marking on the left foreleg. I wouldn't mistake it." He looked at her for a moment. The shop was warm, August heat pressing through the single window. And she'd taken her hair down from its pins, which she only did when it was particularly hot, and it lay across her shoulders in a way that made her look, briefly, more like a person and less like a category. He'd been having that experience with increasing frequency, catching her at angles where she resolved into something specific and particular rather than the general shape of a woman. He pushed that thought aside. There were more pressing things. "You need to be careful," he said. "I am careful." "Hazel." He waited until she looked up at him properly. "These aren't small people doing this. If it's Hale, then there's real money and real organization behind it, and a man like that doesn't get nervous and back away when he thinks someone knows. He handles it." She held his gaze. Her eyes were very calm. "I'm aware of that." "Then you know you're in a situation that could go badly." "Yes," she said. "So are you, actually, now that you know what I know." He hadn't fully articulated that thought yet, but she was right. Whatever she'd worked out, he was now part of. And he was, in this valley, a person with a name and a property and a visible presence, which meant he was, if anything, easier to watch and easier to lean on than she was. "So what do we do?" he asked. He asked it genuinely because it was the honest question, and because he had learned by now that her answer would be worth hearing. She thought for a moment, her needle still, her head slightly tilted in that way she had when she was working something out. "We need proof," she said. "Not pattern, not inference. Actual proof, the kind a sheriff can't ignore." She paused. "Which means we need to know where the cattle are going." The room was very quiet. "And that," she said, "means we probably need to look somewhere we're not supposed to be." The drought tightened. The gossip about outlaws grew louder. Marcus Webb was seen in town twice that week, and on one of those occasions he stood for a long moment on the main street and looked toward Hazel's shop with an expression she caught through her window. Not menacing exactly, but assessing, the look of a man calculating something. She wrote down what she'd seen in the small notebook she kept under the work table. Dates, details, observations. She'd been doing that for 2 weeks now, since the 3rd sighting of the horse with the blaze. She wasn't frightened, exactly. Fear was not a luxury she had ever been able to afford for long. But she was alert, in the way a person gets alert when they have recognized a genuine danger. A full-body, continuous attention to the information coming in. A constant, low-level calculation of options and exits. She thought about what Colt had said. A man like that handles it. She thought about what she'd said back. So are you now. They were both in it, she and Colt, though they hadn't exactly chosen to be together, Or rather, they had chosen each other's company without entirely understanding where that company would lead. The town had been watching them with disapproval for months, and she had thought of that as the danger, the thing to manage. The social consequences, the lost customers, the changed conversations, the looks. She understood now that those were not the danger. The danger was in the canyon that Marcus Webb's careful mileage and the strange new coins and the riders at odd hours all pointed toward somewhere up in the northern ridge where you could hide 100 head of cattle in the rocky draws. And nobody would look because the story about mountain outlaws had given everyone a direction to look that was safely wrong. She thought about telling Colt they should stop, step back, let someone else work it out. But she had lived at the edges of this town for 4 years. She had watched the drought take small operations under while the big ones held on. She had watched men lose years of work to a theft ring while a powerful man sat untouched at the center of it. She was not going to stop. She put her needle down and looked out through the window at the main street of Black Ridge, where the evening light was coming in at a low angle and making everything look, briefly, like a painting of itself. The false front buildings, the dust, the few people still moving between destinations. She pulled the notebook out and opened it to a fresh page. She began to write down everything she knew about the canyon. The notebook filled faster than Hazel expected. She hadn't set out to build a case. She'd set out, in the practical way that governed most of her decisions, simply to organize what she knew, to put the scattered observations into a form that could be examined properly, the way you laid out pieces of a torn garment before attempting to restitch it. You had to see what you had before you could figure out what was missing. That was the principle, and she applied it now the same way she applied it to everything. But the notebook kept filling, and what it filled with was more coherent than she'd expected. She worked at it in the evenings, after the last customer had left, and the light through the window had gone from gold to gray to the blue dark of a dry summer night. The shop was quiet then. The street noise faded, the hardware store next door went silent. The distant sounds of the silver horn carried just far enough to let her know the town was still alive without requiring her to be part of it. She would make herself a cup of coffee, sit at the work table with the lamp pulled close, and write. The entries were not dramatic. She wasn't constructing a narrative. She was recording facts. Marcus Webb, the date, the new coins. The strangers at the Hale Ranch, as reported by the laundress. The horse with the blaze on its left foreleg. 3 sightings, specific dates, and approximate times. A conversation overheard at the dry goods store between 2 ranch hands she recognized as Hale employees. Something about the north draw that had stopped abruptly when they noticed she was in the aisle. The fact that Victor Hale had attended the last 3 community meetings about the cattle thefts, had spoken with visible concern and generosity, had pledged a contribution toward the cost of hiring additional men to patrol the valley roads. That last one she had underlined. Not because it was proof of anything, because it was the kind of detail that, once you started looking at things sideways, changed its meaning. She was staring at that underlined entry when Colt came in on a Friday afternoon, which was not his usual day. She looked up. Something in his face had changed since their last conversation. He looked like a man who had been wrestling with a decision for several days and had come out the other side of it with something that was not quite resolution and not quite peace, but was at least a direction. "I've been asking around," he said. He didn't sit on the stool. He stood near the work table with his arms crossed, the way he stood when he was thinking on his feet. Quietly, just listening. She closed the notebook. "And?" "Tom Pryor told me something when I ran into him at the feed store. About how the thieves cut his fence." He paused. "He said it was done with a specific tool, not a standard wire cutter. Leaves a particular kind of mark on the end of the wire. His brother-in-law does fence work for a living, and he's the one who noticed it." She waited. That same tool mark, Colt said, was on the Sanderson fence, and on what's left of a section of the Grady fence, up on the north pasture. The Gradys lost cattle 2 weeks ago, but they weren't sure if it was theft or if the fence had just given out. Tom's brother-in-law took a look at it. He let that settle. "Same marks, all 3. One tool used on 3 properties," she said. "Or one kind of tool. A specific kind, not something you'd buy at a general store." A beat. "Victor Hale's operation does a lot of its own fence work. They've got the equipment for it." She got up from her stool and went to the window. The main street was mid-afternoon busy. A wagon going past, two women talking outside the milliner's, a boy running with something under his arm. She watched the ordinary surface of things for a moment. "That's still not proof," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it's a pattern. It's another pattern." She turned back to him. "I have a notebook full of patterns. What I don't have is anything a sheriff could hold in his hand." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wagon creaked past and faded. "I've been thinking about the canyon," he said. She looked at him. "Not a plan yet," he said quickly. "I haven't got that far. But I've been thinking about the geography. If you were going to hold stolen cattle somewhere in this valley before moving them, before you had a buyer lined up, or before the heat died down, where would you put them?" She had thought about this too. She'd thought about it at length, with the same methodical attention she brought to a complex alteration, working out where each piece had to go, what structure was required to make the thing hold together. "Not on Hale's land," she said. "Too visible, too risky. If anyone searched his property, it's finished." "Right. Not the southern flats, too open. You'd see a herd from the road, which leaves the north." He said it simply, like a conclusion they'd both been approaching from different sides and had now arrived at simultaneously. "The canyon country. If you know those draws well enough, you can move cattle in and keep them there for weeks without anyone seeing them from the main trail." She picked up the notebook and opened it to the page where she'd started writing about the canyon. She'd put down what she knew, which was less than she'd have liked, because she'd never had reason to go up there, but which was more than nothing. "There's a rancher named Pete Holloway," she said. "He runs a small operation on the edge of the North Ridge. He was in here last month to have a coat repaired." She found the entry. "He mentioned that he'd heard cattle at night in the draws above his property. He thought they were his own that had gotten loose, but when he checked, his herd was accounted for." Colt stared at her. "You wrote that down," he said. "I write most things down," she said without apology. "When did you start keeping this notebook?" She looked at the first entry. 6 weeks ago, when I noticed the pattern in the thefts wasn't consistent with random opportunism." She set it down on the table. "I didn't know what I was building. I just knew the pieces didn't fit the story people were telling, and when things don't fit, I keep notes." He looked at the notebook, then at her, with an expression she couldn't entirely read. Something between admiration and the particular, slightly bewildered respect a person shows when they realize they've been underestimating the depth of something. She had seen that expression on his face before, in smaller moments. It still made her slightly uncomfortable, not because it was unwelcome, but because she didn't know what to do with it. "We need to go up there," he said. "Yes," she said. "We do." The logistics of going were complicated by the fact that they could not be seen to be going. This was not melodrama, it was practical reality. If Victor Hale was orchestrating the theft ring, and the pattern in Hazel's notebook was growing hard to explain any other way, then he had eyes in this town. Marcus Webb was one pair. The man on the horse with the blaze was another. There were almost certainly others, because an operation this size required management, and management required information. And Victor Hale had been managing things in this valley for 30 years. He would know how, which meant that Colt couldn't simply ride north without someone noticing and reporting it, and Hazel couldn't close her shop in the middle of the day without it being remarked upon. The town's attention, which had been their problem for months, was now both a burden and a reminder. Everything they did was watched, commented on, assigned meaning. They worked out the details over 2 visits. Colt came in on a Thursday with a legitimate reason, a pair of work trousers with a blown seam, and while she worked on them at the table, they talked around the edges of what needed to happen in a way that was specific enough to be useful and general enough that, if anyone had been at the window, they would have heard 2 people discussing nothing more interesting than the challenge of getting a good read on the weather this time of year. "Pete Holloway's property," she said, not looking up from the seam. "If someone were riding up toward the north pasture to check on their own fencing concerns, that would be a normal thing. I've got land up there that needs attention anyway," he said. "I can ride up the north road without it being remarkable. And if someone needed to deliver alterations to a customer who lives outside of town," she said, "that's also not unusual. I do it occasionally." He was quiet a moment. Then, "You're not coming into the canyon with me." She looked up at him. "Hazel." He said it in a tone that was firm without being condescending. She gave him credit for that because most men couldn't manage the distinction. If something goes wrong in there, A ranch foreman's job is to protect the operation. That includes making problems disappear. I'm aware of the risk, she said. Then you're aware that if they find me in there, I'm a rancher who got turned around. It's plausible. It's recoverable. He held her gaze. If they find you. If they find me, she said. I'm a woman who was clearly not supposed to be there, and who clearly knows too much. I understand. She set the trousers aside. But you don't know what to look for. And I do. Tell me. Tell me what to look for. She shook her head, not obstinately, but practically. It's not a list. You have to understand the pattern to know what matters when you see it. Records, Colt. Financial records, if there are any, are worth more than 100 head of cattle as evidence. Markings that identify where the cattle came from. Numbers. Written orders. She looked at him steadily. Can you identify brand modifications at a distance, in poor light, without knowing what specific brands to look for? He didn't answer, which was its own answer. I can, she said. I've been looking at this problem for 6 weeks. I know what to look for. A pause. I'll stay back from the actual camp, if there is one. I'll stay with the horses. But I need to be close enough that if you find something you don't recognize, I can look at it. He stared at her for a long moment. She could see him working through it, the reality of the risk, the reality of her argument, the reality of what they were attempting. If I say no, he said, you're going to go up there on your own eventually. I haven't decided that yet, she said honestly, but it's possible. He let out a breath that was not quite a laugh. That is not reassuring. I know. She picked the trousers back up. Come back Saturday. I'll have these done, and we can settle on a date. The date they settled on was a Tuesday in the last week of August. The choice of Tuesday was deliberate. It was the day Victor Hale was known to travel to the county seat for business, a pattern consistent enough over several months that it had become unremarkable. His absence didn't guarantee safety, but it reduced the probability of the worst-case version of getting caught. They left before full light, separately. Colt rode out his north gate on a route that any early-rising hand might have seen and dismissed as routine. Hazel left her shop through the back, on foot, and walked the 2 long blocks to the livery where she kept a horse she rarely used, a small bay mare named Soot, steady, if not fast. She'd arranged the previous day to take Soot out for exercise, which was normal enough that the livery hand had noted it without interest. They met at the junction of the North Road and the Holloway Track, where a stand of cottonwoods gave enough cover to make the meeting invisible from the main road. The morning was still cool. Hazel had dressed practically, her everyday clothes, nothing that would stand out if they were seen before reaching the ridge, though she'd forgone the dress she usually wore in favor of a split riding skirt she kept for the rare occasions she needed it. Colt took one look at her and seemed to revise some internal assessment without comment, which she appreciated. Ready? He said. I've been ready for 6 weeks, she said, and turned Soot toward the ridge. It took 2 hours to reach the canyon mouth. The terrain roughened steadily as they climbed, the trail narrowing from a recognizable path to a suggestion of a path to something that was mostly rock and instinct. The cottonwoods gave way to pine, and the pine gave way to scrub and exposed stone, and the world contracted to the immediate. The next footing, the next turn, the weight of the altitude in the lungs. They didn't talk much on the way up. There wasn't a lot to say that wasn't already understood, and conversation on a narrow trail required attention that was better spent on the ground in front of the horses. Hazel watched the terrain and watched Colt's back and kept her own counsel. She had made a kind of peace with the risk somewhere between leaving town and reaching the ridge. Not a comfortable peace. She wasn't built for comfortable. More the peace of a decision already made, where the energy that used to go to second-guessing now had nowhere to go and so settled into something steadier. She thought for a moment about what would happen if this went wrong. She had no family to notify. She had a shop with a month's rent paid and a customer's coat that wasn't finished. She had a notebook under the work table that would tell someone, if they looked, exactly what she'd been doing and why. The thought passed through her and she let it go. The canyon mouth appeared around a turn in the trail, a narrowing between 2 rock faces that opened further into a wider bowl that she'd estimated from Holloway's description and from what she could read of the terrain. Colt reined his horse and they sat there for a moment, listening. Wind through rock. birds, somewhere above. And further in, faintly, the sound that doesn't mistake itself for anything else once you've grown up around cattle. Low, bovine, the patient sound of animals standing in a place they didn't choose. Colt looked back at her. She nodded once. Yes, we go. The camp was set further in than she'd expected. Whoever had chosen this location had chosen it carefully. The approach required navigating 3 separate turns that blocked sight lines from outside, so that you were essentially inside the operation before you could see anything useful. The canyon widened into a bowl maybe 200 yards across, with water from a seasonal spring that was still running despite the drought, and the cattle, she counted quickly, approximately 40 head, possibly more in the further shadows, were penned against the rock wall with rope fencing that was temporary but adequate. There were 2 structures. A rough lean-to that served as a bunkhouse. She could see bedrolls and the remains of a fire that had been allowed to go cold, which meant no one was here at the moment. And a second, smaller structure, more carefully built, with a padlocked door. 1 guard. She'd expected more, but the Tuesday timing had apparently done its work. Whoever usually staffed this place was elsewhere, leaving a single man seated on a rock near the cattle pen with a rifle across his knees and the posture of someone who had been sitting there for several hours and was no longer paying the quality of attention he'd been hired to pay. Colt pulled up behind a rock formation at the edge of the bowl, and they stayed there, not moving, not speaking, reading the scene. She counted the cattle again. 43, she thought. The Pryor brand she could see from here, a running P, on at least 6 of them. Though 2 of those had been worked on, the brand blurred and partially overwritten with something that was meant to look like a different mark. Sloppy work. Done in a hurry, probably. To someone who didn't know what to look for, it might pass. To her, it was as clear as a badly repaired buttonhole that someone had tried to hide by pressing it flat. The small building, she breathed, barely audible. Colt looked at it, looked at the guard, did the calculation she was also doing. 20 yards of open ground, he breathed back. The guard shifted on his rock, rolled his neck, looked in the direction of the cattle, not the structures behind him. Colt moved before she could suggest the alternative, which told her that some part of this plan had always been his. He took a long, low route around the perimeter of the bowl, staying behind the rock where it offered cover, moving in a way that was so deliberate and unhurried that it barely registered as movement. The way experienced hunters moved, she thought, the way people moved when they'd spent years learning the language of terrain. She watched the guard. She watched Colt. She kept her breathing even and her hands still on the reins because Soot could feel tension through the contact, and a spooked horse right now would end everything. It took 12 minutes. She counted. Colt reached the small building, tried the padlock, found it locked, and then she watched him look around, find something on the ground near the structure, and crouch. A moment later, the padlock opened. She couldn't see what he'd used and didn't need to. There were ways, if you'd been working with mechanisms long enough, and Colt had spent 15 years maintaining a ranch. He was inside for 6 minutes. When he came back the long way, the same deliberate perimeter route, and when he reached her position, he was carrying nothing in his hands, nothing you could see. But his expression had changed in the way she'd been waiting for. Not triumph, because Colt didn't do triumph, but a settling, a confirmed wait, the look of a man who has opened a door and found exactly the thing that explained every other thing. Records, he said, voice low, flat. Ledgers, letters. A pause. 3 letters with Victor Hale's signature. Specific amounts, specific dates, specific names of buyers across the state line. Hazel closed her eyes for 1 second. She opened them. You left everything as you found it? Exactly. The padlock. Locked. I found a key on a hook inside the doorframe, left it there. He glanced at the guard who had shifted again on his rock and was now staring at the canyon wall with the unfocused vacancy of a bored man. We need to go, now, while he's not looking. She turned Soot and they went, back through the 3 turns, back up the narrowing trail, back through the pine and the scrub and the long exposed rock of the upper ridge. They didn't speak until they were well clear of the canyon mouth and the wind had come up and covered the sound of the horses. Then she said, Hale's signature on the letters, specific amounts. Yes, he said. That's not patterns, she said. No, he said. That's proof. They came down the ridge separately, the same way they'd gone up. because the care that had gotten them in and out of the canyon safely was not a thing to abandon 10 minutes from the end. Hazel reached the livery by midday, returned soot, thanked the hand with the brevity that was her normal register, and walked back to the shop through a town that didn't know anything had changed. It looked the same. The dry goods store with Marta Cleve visible through the window, rearranging something on a shelf. The silver horn with its doors propped open. 3 horses at the rail. The post office, the bank, the milliners, the false fronts and the dust and the ordinary life of a small valley town carrying on its business on a Tuesday morning as though nothing in particular were happening. She let herself in the back of the shop, put water on for coffee, sat down at the work table, and let her hands shake for about 90 seconds. They shook badly. She watched them doing it with a detached, almost clinical interest, the body's accounting for what the mind had been suppressing for the past 4 hours. The guard and the open ground and the 6 minutes that Colt had been inside that building with a rifle 20 yards away. The 43 cattle with the modified brands. The cold fire in the lean-to and the implication of how many people had been sleeping there. Then the shaking stopped, the way it does, because the body finishes what it started and moves on. She poured the coffee. She opened the notebook. She began to write down everything she'd seen, in order, with the same precise attention she brought to everything, while it was still fresh and exact. She was 3 pages in when she heard the bell above the front door. She closed the notebook and stood up. It was not a customer. It was not Colt. He'd said he would stay away from the shop for a few days, longer than his usual gap, so as not to create a pattern that could be noted. It was Marcus Webb. He was a large man, Webb, broad through the chest, with the kind of presence that filled a doorway without quite threatening it, the way a weather system fills a sky. She had seen him in the shop before, picking up the saddlebag, the collar, and each time he'd been professionally neutral, the way a man is when he's been given instructions about how to behave in a particular setting. Today, he didn't have anything to pick up. He stood just inside the door, which he had not fully closed behind him, and he looked at the shop in a general way that didn't settle on anything specific for long. "Afternoon," he said. "Afternoon," she said. She went to the work table and stood behind it, not because it offered protection, it didn't, particularly, but because it gave her something to do with her hands and a reason to be standing where she was standing. She pulled a half-finished piece of work toward her and picked up the needle. "Can I help you?" "Just checking," he said. "I had a collar repaired here a while back, wondering if there's a smarter way to stitch the inside edge so it doesn't go again." It was a reasonable thing to ask. It was also, she noted, not what he was here for. "Flat fell stitch on the interior," she said without missing a beat. "Stronger than a basic hem. Takes longer, but it holds." He nodded. He was looking around the shop in that general, apparently casual way. Her notebook was under the work table. She was approximately sure he couldn't see it from where he was standing. She kept her hands on the fabric and her eyes on her work, and let the silence do what silence does. Expand, fill, pressure. "You've been around a good while now," he said. 4 years? "About that," she said. "Quiet kind of business." He finally looked at her directly, which she'd been expecting. "You see a lot of people come through. Hear a lot of things, I'd imagine." "People talk," she said. She looked up at him, steadily, without challenge, without submission. The direct gray-green gaze she'd been told all her life was unsettling, and had decided all her life was simply how she looked at things. "I mostly listen." "That right?" He said it flat, not a question. "Alterations and mending?" she said pleasantly. "It's not a business that lends itself to much else." He looked at her for a moment longer. She looked back. Neither of them was performing ease. It was more like 2 people having a conversation underneath the conversation, in which a great deal of information was being exchanged without anything being said that could later be pointed to. "Well," he said finally, "I'll think about the flat fell stitch." "Happy to show you the technique if you bring the collar in," she said. He nodded once, turned, and left. The bell rang. She watched through the window as he walked back up the main street without looking back. She stood very still for a moment. Then she went back to the notebook and added an entry. M. Webb. In shop. No stated purpose. Awareness confirmed. She underlined that last part. Awareness confirmed. Which meant the window of time they had, between what had happened this morning in the canyon and whatever Marcus Webb would now report to Victor Hale and whatever Victor Hale would do about it, was not large. She sat back down, picked up the unfinished piece of work, and thought very carefully about what came next. Because Webb's visit meant one thing with clarity. Someone had seen them going north, or had guessed, or had noticed something out of place that Webb had been sent to assess. And Webb had come away from this shop with a woman who'd answered his questions pleasantly and revealed nothing, which bought time. But not much. She needed Colt, and she needed to reach him without going to his ranch, which was too visible, and without sending a message through anyone, because messages could be intercepted or remembered. She thought about it for a moment, then picked up a piece of paper and wrote a note, brief and specific, that said only, "I need the clasp on the brown bag repaired. Available Thursday." She folded it, sealed it, and addressed it to C. Mercer, and took it to the post office herself at the end of the afternoon. Anyone reading it would see a customer requesting a repair. He would know what it meant. But he came in Thursday morning with a brown bag. She hadn't expected him to actually bring one, and for a moment the ordinary reality of it, the fact that he'd found a bag and brought it, almost made her smile, and set it on the counter. "The clasp," he said. "I see it." She looked at the bag, which had a perfectly functional clasp, and then at him. Webb came in Tuesday afternoon. His expression didn't change visibly. He sat down on the stool. "What did he want?" "He asked me about collar stitching. He wanted me to know he was aware of me." She took the bag and turned it over, looking at the clasp with the same focus she brought to an actual repair. "He didn't threaten. He also didn't need to. How long do you think we have?" "Days," she said. "Not weeks. Webb will have told Hale that I don't appear to know anything specific. That's what my body language told him. But Hale is a careful man. Careful men don't leave loose ends loose." Colt was quiet. "Here's what I think," she said. She set the bag down and looked at him properly. "We can't go to the sheriff with a description of what you saw in that building. You were trespassing. There's no evidence in our hands. Everything in that canyon stays exactly where it is until a proper search is authorized." She paused. "So we need authorization, which means we need someone who will go to the sheriff with enough credibility to get him to move, and move fast, before Hale has time to clean that canyon out." "Who?" "Someone inside Hale's operation," she said. "Someone who knows enough to corroborate everything you saw. Who can put dates and names and amounts into a sworn statement without needing to explain how we got into that canyon?" She let the implications settle. "Webb is too loyal and too implicated, but the foreman before Webb, a man named Garrett, Roy Garrett, he left Hale's employ about 8 months ago. I heard from the laundress that it wasn't friendly." "You think Garrett knows?" "I think a foreman always knows," she said. "And a foreman who left badly is a man with something he's been holding on to. If someone offered him a reason to let it go..." She looked at Colt. "That's the lever." He sat with it for a moment, working it through. "Roy Garrett," he said. "I know the name. He's working a small place out near Ridgeway now, about 12 miles. Can you ride there without it looking like anything?" "I can make it look like a land inquiry," he said slowly. "I've been thinking about expanding in that direction. It's known." He looked at her. "Is this the plan?" "Talk to Garrett." "It's the beginning of one," she said honestly. "I won't pretend I know exactly how it plays out from there. But Garrett is the thread. If he's willing, if he can be convinced that staying quiet is more dangerous to him now than speaking, then we have something." She met his eyes. "It has to be you. He won't talk to me." Colt nodded. Slowly, with the weight of a man who understood that this was the moment where the thing became real. Not the canyon, not the notebook, but this, the act of going to a man and asking him to put himself in the path of Victor Hale's wrath. "And if he says no?" Colt said. She looked at the notebook under the table, thought about Webb's flat eyes and the 43 cattle with the blurred brands and the letters signed in Victor Hale's hand. "Then we figure out something else," she said. "But I don't think he'll say no." She didn't say why she thought that, and he didn't ask. But she'd been watching people for 4 years from a position of careful invisibility, and she'd developed a specific intuition for the men who were carrying something they needed, eventually, to put down. Roy Garrett, from everything she'd assembled, was carrying something very heavy. It was nearly time for him to set it down. Colt rode out to Ridgeway on a Friday morning, which was the kind of ordinary morning that asked nothing of you. Pale sky, a thin wind coming off the ridge, the smell of dry grass that had been dry for so long it had stopped smelling like grass and started smelling like the memory of grass. He told Deke he was going to look at a piece of land he'd heard about east of Ridgeway, which was not entirely a lie. There was land out there. He had thought about it vaguely, the way a man thinks about many things that don't quite rise to the level of decision. The story would hold if anyone asked, which was the minimum requirement of a cover that didn't need to be airtight, just plausible enough to not invite a second question. He found Roy Garrett's place without much difficulty. It was small, a modest house, a barn that leaned slightly to the left in a way that suggested the builder had run out of either time or lumber before the project was finished. A pasture with maybe 30 head of mixed cattle that were decent animals, well kept, nothing remarkable. The kind of operation a man built when he'd had something bigger and lost it, and was starting over with less than he used to have, and knew it, and was trying not to let that knowledge show in the way he held himself. Garrett was out by the barn when Colt rode up. He was a man in his mid-50s, medium height, with the kind of face that had once been good-looking in a functional, angular way, and now just looked experienced. Lines around the eyes, a jaw that had set hard, gray at the temples that had not come gently. He looked up when he heard the horse, and his eyes did the rapid assessment that men who've spent their lives around other men in rough situations develop as second nature. Who is this? Do I know him? What does he want? How much trouble is he? Morning, Colt said. He reined up about 15 feet out, which was the polite distance. The distance that said, I'm not here for a confrontation. Morning. Garrett held a fence post wrench in his right hand, not threateningly, just because that was what he'd been doing. Help you with something? Maybe, Colt said. If you've got a few minutes. Name's Colt Mercer. I've got a ranch up in the Black Ridge Valley. Something moved across Garrett's face at the mention of Black Ridge. Not quite recognition, not quite alarm, something in between that settled back into neutral before it fully resolved. I know the name, he said. Get down if you want. They sat on the porch, a narrow porch with two chairs that didn't match, and a view of the pasture and the low hills beyond it. Garrett didn't offer coffee, which told Colt something about either the state of the man's hospitality or his assessment of how long this visit was going to last. He brought a jar of water, which was practical rather than warm, and set it on the rail between them. I'm going to be direct, Colt said, because he'd been thinking on the ride out about how to approach this, and had concluded that Roy Garrett was not a man who would respond well to being managed. I'm here about Victor Hale. The jar of water sat on the rail between them, and neither man touched it. Garrett's face went through something, a compression, a tightening around the jaw and eyes, like a man bracing against wind. Then it let go, partly, the way things do when they've been held too long. That right, he said, flat, non-committal. I know what's in the canyon, Colt said, north of Black Ridge, up past the Holloway track. I've seen the cattle, and I've seen the building, and I've seen what's in the building. Silence. The wind moved across the pasture, and the cattle moved with it. The easy, mindless drift of animals that don't know anything is wrong. You break in? Garrett said. I found an unlocked door, Colt said, which was close enough to true that he could live with it. Garrett looked at him for a long time. He had gray eyes, this man, not the gray-green of Hazel's, but a flatter gray, the kind that had seen things and sorted them into categories of useful and not useful and filed the rest away. What do you want from me? I want you to talk to the sheriff, Colt said. Tell him what you know. Give him grounds for a proper search. A short, humorless sound from Garrett, not quite a laugh. You know what Victor Hale does to people who talk? I have an idea. Do you? He shifted in the chair, the movement of a man with old physical discomforts he'd learned to accommodate. 8 months ago, when I left Hale's operation, I left with exactly what I came with, which was not much. He looked at the pasture. You know why I left? I'd like to hear it. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He picked up the jar of water and turned it in his hands without drinking from it, which seemed to be how he thought. I worked for Victor Hale for 11 years, he said. 11 years. I knew his operation better than I know my own face. I knew where every head of cattle had come from, what it cost, what it was worth. I knew his books, his contracts, his buyers. A pause. I thought I knew what kind of man he was. Colt waited. The first time I found out about the other books, Garrett said, I told myself I'd misunderstood, that there was an explanation I wasn't seeing. He set the jar back on the rail. The second time, I told myself I'd keep my head down and do my job and it wasn't my business. He looked at Colt. The third time, which was about a year ago, I told myself that I had 11 years in and I couldn't afford to make an enemy of Victor Hale. His jaw tightened. So I kept my mouth shut, and I told myself I'd find the right time. There's never a right time for something like this, Colt said, but there's sometimes a necessary time. Garrett looked at him with something that was partly assessment and partly something older and harder, the look of a man who has been waiting for someone to say a specific thing out loud so that he could stop arguing with himself about it. What changed? He said. Why now? What made you go up to that canyon? Colt thought about how to answer that. He thought about Hazel, sitting in her narrow shop, building a picture out of overheard conversations and small observations, the notebook under the work table filling with the kind of careful, unglamorous intelligence work that nobody would ever think to look for in a seamstress. Someone saw what I didn't see, he said. Someone who's been watching the pattern of this thing for 6 weeks, from a position where nobody thought she was paying attention. Garrett studied him. The Rowan woman, he said. Colt kept his face even, but something inside him shifted. A cold, precise alertness. You know her? I don't know her, but Webb mentioned her. Garrett's voice dropped slightly. Said she was a person of interest to Hale. Said she noticed things. He looked at Colt squarely. Said she was spending time with you. The cold alertness sharpened. When did Webb say this? Week ago, maybe more. Garrett turned the wrench over in his hands. You understand what that means? When Victor Hale decides someone is a person of interest, he doesn't mean it as a compliment. Colt absorbed that without letting it show on his face, because showing it wouldn't help anything and would use up energy he needed for the rest of this conversation. He filed it carefully in the part of his mind that dealt with things that required immediate action later. Then we don't have weeks, he said. We might have days. That's about what I'd estimate, Garrett said. He's methodical, Hale. He doesn't move fast unless he has to, but when something moves close enough to threaten him... He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Roy, Colt said. He used the man's name deliberately because this was the moment where the conversation became personal rather than abstract, and you needed a name for that. You said you kept looking for the right time. I'm telling you, this is the necessary time. Not because it's comfortable, because the alternative is that those cattle keep disappearing, and the men who lost them don't get anything back, and Victor Hale walks away clean, and 2 people who figured out what he was doing pay for it. He let that sit for exactly the right number of seconds. And you keep carrying what you've been carrying for a year on this small piece of land alone. The word alone did something. Garrett's face changed. Not dramatically, not visibly to anyone who wasn't looking for it. But the jaw loosened a fraction, and something behind the flat gray eyes shifted from held back to something more like tired. I'd need protection, he said, Chait. Something in writing from the sheriff before I say a word. Immunity from prosecution, because I knew about it, and I didn't report it, which makes me... I understand, Colt said. That's a reasonable ask, and I'd need time to get what I have. A pause. I kept copies. Of some things. Not everything, but enough. He looked at his hands. I told myself I was keeping them in case I needed them for my own protection. But I think... He stopped, turned the wrench over once more. I think I kept them because I knew this moment was going to come eventually. Colt felt something in his chest loosen that had been tight since Tuesday morning in the canyon. Where are they? Locked box in the barn. I'll get them. He stood up, and then he stopped, and he looked at Colt with the directness of a man who had decided to stop calculating and simply say what was true. The Rowan woman. Is she safe right now? I don't know, Colt said honestly. That's why I need to get back. He rode back to Black Ridge in less time than it had taken to ride out, because on the way out he'd been thinking, and on the way back he was just moving. He had the copies Garrett had given him in his saddlebag, a small sheaf of folded papers that represented 11 years of careful observation by a man who had finally decided that what he knew was more dangerous to keep than to release. Letters. Partial ledgers. A list of buyers across the state line, with amounts and dates. Not everything that was in the building in the canyon, but enough, more than enough, to give a sheriff grounds for a search. The problem was the sheriff. Wade Connolly had been sheriff of Black Ridge County for 7 years, which was long enough to have developed specific loyalties that didn't entirely align with the law in its abstract form. He wasn't a bad man, in Colt's estimation, but he was a man who had learned to read the room before he acted, and the room in Black Ridge County had, for as long as anyone could remember, contained Victor Hale. Going to Connolly with Garrett's documents was the right move. It was also a move that had to be timed and positioned carefully because the wrong approach would give Hale enough warning to move the cattle out of the canyon, destroy the records, and present a version of events that made Colt and Hazel and Roy Garrett look like a conspiracy of grudge holders rather than witnesses. Colt turned all of this over on the ride back, the practical architecture of it, and by the time he reached the edge of town, he had a rough shape of a plan. Not a complete one, nothing as clean as that, but a direction. He went to the shop. Hazel heard the bell and looked up, and something in the way he moved when he came through the door told her, before he said anything, that the visit had worked. And then she looked at his face more carefully and saw the other thing underneath the first thing, and her hands stilled on the fabric. "Tell me the good part first," she said. He sat down on the stool. He put his hat on the work table. He told her about Garrett, the conversation on the porch, the copies in the barn, the fact that the man had been waiting for an excuse to do the right thing for 8 months and had simply needed someone to come to him with the necessity of it plain enough to see. She listened without interrupting. "Good," she said when he finished. "That's good." And she meant it, but her voice had the particular even quality it got when she was managing something. "He knew your name," Colt said. "Webb told him you were a person of interest to Hale." She was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. He counted. "When?" she said. "A week or more ago." She nodded slowly. She set down the needle. She looked at the work table in front of her with the expression of someone reorganizing their internal map to account for new terrain. "I expected something like this," she said. "Not the specific detail, but the general shape of it." She looked up. "It means the timeline is shorter than I'd thought." "I know. And it means Connolly needs to move before Hale does." She folded her hands in her lap. "Tell me about Connolly. What does he respond to?" This was one of the things about her that he'd stopped being surprised by and had started simply accepting as part of what she was. The way she moved directly to the actionable question, skipping over the stage where most people would have wanted to sit for a moment with the alarming information. "Connolly responds to being given no choice," Colt said. "He's not a man who leads. He's a man who responds when the situation is clear enough that not responding is worse than responding." "Then we make it clear," she said. "Garrett's documents are enough for a search warrant. If you bring those to Connolly and you tell him that Roy Garrett is prepared to give a sworn statement, and that the sworn statement implicates Victor Hale in a theft ring that has stolen from 12 ranches in his county," she paused. "The political weight of doing nothing becomes heavier than the political weight of Victor Hale." "Maybe," Colt said, "if Connolly doesn't warn Hale first." "Who goes with you?" she asked. "When you talk to Connolly." He thought about it. "Tom Pryor lost 11 head. He's been loudest about wanting action. If I bring Pryor, bring more than Pryor." She had picked up the needle again, not because she was working, but because her hands operated independently of her reasoning processes and didn't like being still. "Bring 3 ranchers, men who've lost cattle, men whose names carry weight with Connolly. Make it so that what Connolly is looking at is not one man with a story, but a room full of men with losses and evidence and a witness prepared to testify." He thought about the logistics of assembling that group without alerting Webb or anyone else watching. The mechanics were possible. He could reach Pryor and 2 others through routes that wouldn't draw attention, ranch-to-ranch visits that were ordinary enough. "I'll need a day," he said. "You have a day," she said. "Maybe 2. But I want you to go to Connolly the day after tomorrow, Saturday morning, before Hale has time for a full week of planning." He nodded. Then, "You'll stay in the shop." She looked at him. "Not because I'm telling you to," he said, "because there's nothing for you to do at the sheriff's office that I can't do. And being visible there gives Hale's people information about how much you're involved." She considered this. It was correct, and she knew it was correct. which made it both easier and harder to accept. Easier because she was a practical woman and practicality didn't have much patience for false pride. Harder because she had been managing her own dangers alone for 4 years, and the instinct to keep doing that was deep. "Fine," she said. "I'll be here." She met his eyes. "But I want to know what Connolly says within an hour of you leaving his office." "I'll come straight here." "And Colt." She set the needle down again and spoke plainly, because plain was what this required. "If something goes wrong between now and Saturday, if Webb comes back or if anyone else comes in here who feels wrong, I'll send you a note. Same method." "Brown bag," he said. "Brown bag," she agreed. The next day, Friday, stretched in the particular way that days stretch when you are waiting for a thing without being able to move toward it. Hazel worked. She worked the way she always worked, with careful and complete attention, because the work didn't stop requiring attention just because other things required it too, and because focus was the thing that kept the rest manageable. She finished the coat that had been waiting. She repaired a torn riding boot upper for a ranch hand who came in and barely looked at her, which was familiar. She did a collar repair for a woman named Joanna Birch, who was one of the only people in Black Ridge who had been consistently, if quietly, decent to her. The kind of decency that didn't make a production of itself. Just a nod, a genuine word, the simple human acknowledgement that both parties existed. Joanna Birch was in the shop at mid-morning, waiting for the caller, when she said something that Hazel filed carefully. "I heard Victor Hale is riding to the county seat Monday," she said. She was looking at a bolt of fabric, and she said it the way women said things in that shop sometimes. In the register of general conversation, the things you mentioned because you'd heard them and they floated up. Hazel kept working. "Is that so? His housekeeper mentioned it to my sister. Apparently he has business there that couldn't wait." Joanna turned the fabric over. "He doesn't usually go twice in 1 month." Hazel finished the collar and handed it over and thanked Joanna and said the right things while Joanna paid and left. Then she stood at the work table for a moment and turned this information over very carefully. Victor Hale, riding to the county seat on Monday. Business that couldn't wait. A man who learned that the ground was shifting under him would do one of two things: move against the threat directly, or move to consolidate the protection that money bought. The county seat was where judges lived, where lawyers could be assembled quietly over a weekend, where a man with resources could begin building the architecture of his defense before the attack was visible to anyone else, which meant Hale knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough. Which meant Saturday was not just preferable. Saturday was the deadline. She wrote a note. 1 sentence. "The clasp is urgent. Come tonight if you can." She sent it with the afternoon mail, which she walked to the post office herself, and she went back to the shop and she worked until the light failed, and then she sat in the dark of the back room for a while and waited. He came at 8. The town was settling into its evening patterns. The silver horn getting louder, the main street emptying of the respectable, the particular quality of dark that a dry summer night had when the heat stayed in the air after the light left. He came through the back, which was not their established arrangement, but she'd left the back door unlatched, and she was learning, a man who noticed things like unlatched doors and understood what they meant. She told him about Joanna Birch's mention of the county seat. He was quiet for a longer moment than usual. "Monday," he said. "If he reaches those contacts before Connolly acts." She didn't finish the sentence. They both knew what it meant. A man with money and a lawyer and a weekend's preparation could make evidence complicated, could make witnesses unreliable, could make the sheriff's investigation look like a vendetta by disgruntled ranchers against the most successful man in the valley. "I'll go to Pryor tonight," Colt said. "And Sanderson and Cal Grady. I'll bring them to Connolly first thing tomorrow morning." "Do you have Garrett's documents with you?" "Back at the ranch." "Get them tonight," she said. "Don't leave them there overnight. If someone goes through your property, they'd need a reason." "They have a reason," she said. "You rode to Ridgeway. Someone may have seen it, may have reported it, may have told Hale you visited a man who used to work for him." She looked at him. "Get the documents. Keep them on your person. And go to Connolly tomorrow before he's had his second cup of coffee, before the days started giving him reasons to be cautious." He stood up. In the low light of the lamp, she could see the particular set of his face that came with the decision fully made. The stillness that came after the considering was done. "You should have someone with you tonight," he said. "I'm fine." "Hazel." He said her name the way he'd been saying it for months, which was not like a handle or a label, but like a specific thing he was addressing, the actual person, the whole of it. "I know you're capable of being fine on your own. I'm not arguing that. I'm saying that tonight is different from other nights, and being capable doesn't mean it's a good idea to be alone." She looked at him. The lamplight was low and warm and the back room was small, and she was aware, as she'd been increasingly aware, of the specific gravity of being in the same space as this man. Not in any dramatic sense, just the fact of it, the way some presences took up exactly the room they took up and didn't apologize for it. "There's nobody I'd trust to ask," she said. "Joanna Birch would come if I asked, but I'm not putting her in this." "I could stay," he said. The offer was direct and without decoration, which was entirely consistent with who he was, and for a moment she just sat with it. The straightforward, practical generosity of it, and the other thing underneath it that neither of them had named yet, and that the current situation was not the moment to name. "That would cause exactly the kind of talk," she started. "I know what it would cause," he said. "I'm not asking about the talk." She looked at him for a moment, then, "You sleep in the front room? There's a chair that folds?" "That's fine," he said. "And you leave before first light." "That's also fine." She stood up and got the folded chair from the corner and set it up near the door, and he sat in it with his back against the wall and his hat on his knee in the particular way of a man who'd spent many nights in rough places and knew how to sleep light. She went to the back room. She lay down on her cot without undressing, which she'd been planning to do anyway, and she looked at the ceiling in the dark and listened to the night sounds of the town and the distant, ordinary noise of the silver horn and the occasional creak of the chair in the front room. She did not sleep much, but she slept better than she'd expected. Chugged. He was gone when she woke, the folded chair back in its corner and the front door latched behind him as though nothing had happened, which in the technical sense, nothing had. She made coffee and looked at the notebook. She'd been adding to it last night before he arrived. Details she was not sure she'd need, but that felt important to have recorded. The shape of the thing, fully assembled now, was clear and specific and disturbing in the way that clear and specific disturbing things were more disturbing than vague ones. She turned to a fresh page and wrote down, from memory, everything she knew about the canyon, the building, the records, the number of cattle, the brands, the modifications. She wrote it as a statement, formal in structure, detailed, the kind of thing that could be read aloud in a room with a sheriff and sound like what it was. Evidence, assembled carefully, by someone who had been paying attention. She dated it and signed it. She was not sure she would ever be asked to produce it, but she had learned, over the years, that the work you did in preparation for the worst possibility was never wasted, even when the worst didn't come. Colt came in at 11, which was later than she'd expected. She looked up from a repair the moment she heard his boots, and she read his face before he reached the door. Not the face of a man who had failed, not the face of a man who had succeeded cleanly, but something between. The face of a man who had done the necessary thing and was now living inside the particular suspended tension of waiting to see if the necessary thing was going to be enough. "He's going," he said. She put down the needle. "Connolly," he said. "Pryor and Sanderson and Grady came with me, and we were in his office before 8. I put Garrett's documents on his desk. Pryor gave numbers. How many head, what value, how long the losses had been happening. He sat down on the stool, which was the first time he'd sat without taking off his hat first. Connolly pushed back. You could see him thinking about Hale, about the county seat and the relationship and what this was going to cost him politically. "What changed his mind?" she said. "I told him Victor Hale was writing to the county seat on Monday," Colt said. "I told him that a man who'd learned the ground was moving would do that. Go to the lawyers before the sheriff came to him. And I told him that if a judge in the county seat got to Hale's version of events first, before Connolly had made a move, it wasn't going to be Victor Hale who looked bad in the aftermath." Hazel exhaled slowly. "You made it about his position." "I made it about the math," he said, "which is what it was." He finally took off his hat. "He's assembling his deputies this afternoon. They'll ride to the canyon tomorrow morning, first light, with Garrett's documents as grounds for the search." She sat with that for a moment. The feeling it produced was not triumph, exactly. She'd never been able to sustain triumph for long, because triumph required a kind of faith in the permanence of outcomes that experience had not quite allowed her. It was more like, okay, this part worked. Now we see what the next part brings. Did Connolly ask about me? She said. Something moved across Colt's face. He asked how I knew about the canyon. I told him I'd been following a lead. He didn't push? He didn't want to know, Colt said. He wanted the documents and the ranchers and a reason to act. He got those things. The rest he filed away as things he could address later, which is how Connolly operates. She understood that. Some people's practicality looked like courage, and some people's looked like avoidance, and often they arrived at the same place. And Garrett, she said, Garrett is coming in tomorrow afternoon, after the search is done, to give his statement. He looked at her steadily. Connolly agreed to the immunity, in writing, this morning. She nodded. She picked up the needle again. Outside the window, the main street moved through its afternoon business. Horses, a wagon, the sound of someone's hammer somewhere down the block. The ordinary surface of a Thursday in Black Ridge, carrying on without knowing it was the last Thursday before everything changed. There's something else, Colt said. His voice had shifted. Not dramatically, but she heard it, the slight drop into a different register. She looked up. Webb, he said. I asked Connolly to have a deputy watch the Hale property tonight. Keep anyone from riding north. Good. And I asked him to keep an eye on this street. He met her eyes. On this building. She held his gaze. She wanted to say she didn't need that, which was the instinct. 4 years of independence, 4 years of managing her own safety, and the instinct to refuse help was ground in deep. But Garrett's voice was in her mind. When Victor Hale decides someone is a person of interest, and Webb's flat eyes, a week ago in this room. All right, she said. Something shifted in his expression. Something small, almost imperceptible. The slight release of a tension she hadn't known he'd been holding. The deputy will be across the street at the hardware store, he said. Just visible, not advertising anything. Colt. She said his name the way she said things she meant to land cleanly. Thank you. He didn't say you're welcome, which was correct, because it wasn't that kind of thanks. He just nodded once, the way he acknowledged things he took seriously, simply, without amplification. She went back to the repair in her hands. He sat on the stool for a while, and neither of them spoke, and the silence sat between them in the particular way it had always sat, without weight, without pressure, like the space inside a structure that's been built solidly enough to hold it. Outside, the afternoon light moved across the main street. The hammer sounds continued somewhere down the block. A dog barked twice and then stopped. Tomorrow morning, before the town was properly awake, Wade Connolly and his deputies would ride north. And the shape of Black Ridge, the hierarchy, the certainties, the arrangements of power that everyone had accepted so long they'd stopped seeing them as arrangements, was about to be broken open. Hazel's needle moved through the fabric in its small, steady arc. The stitches held. Hazel did not sleep Saturday night. She did not make a production of this. She lay on her cot in the back room with her eyes open and listened to the town go through its late-night rhythms. The silver horn peaking and then slowly quieting, the last horses leaving the main street, the particular deep silence of a small town in the early hours, when even the restless ones had gone still. She listened for other things too, without naming what she was listening for, because naming it would have given it too much weight. The deputy Colt had arranged was somewhere across the street. She'd seen him earlier, a young man named Aldous, whom she recognized from his occasional presence around the sheriff's office, solid without being imposing, currently finding reasons to exist near Ed Calloway's hardware store at an hour when hardware stores were closed. He'd glanced at her shop once, briefly, in a way that was meant to be reassuring and approximately was. She got up at 4 a.m. and made coffee and sat at the work table in the dark with the lamp turned very low and looked at the notebook. She had read it so many times now that the entries were partly memorized, but she read it again anyway. Not for the information, which she had, but for the act of reading it, the way you checked a knot before trusting it with weight. Everything was there. Everything was as precise as she'd been able to make it. If this went the way it needed to go, the notebook would not be needed. If it didn't, it would be the clearest possible account of what had happened and why. She turned to the last entry, the statement she'd written 2 days ago, dated and signed. and read it through once more. Then she closed the notebook, put it under the work table, and did the only thing available to her. She went back to bed and waited for morning. Morning came the way mornings came during drought, sharp and bright and without mercy, the sun arriving already warm, the sky the specific deep blue that meant no weather was coming. Nothing was going to change the dry facts of the day. Connolly and his deputies had left before dawn. She knew this because she'd heard very faintly through the front wall of the shop the sound of horses moving in the early dark. More than two, more than three, moving north on the main road at a pace that was deliberate rather than urgent. The pace of men who had a specific destination and a specific purpose, and were not advertising either. She opened the shop at the usual time. She turned the sign. She put water on for coffee and stood in the front room and looked at the main street filling up with its Saturday morning business and felt the strangeness of it. The absolute ordinary surface of things. The way the town had no idea what was moving through it. Marta Cleve walked past with a basket on her arm. A ranch hand Hazel recognized as working out at the Dunmore place led a horse toward the farrier. Two boys ran after something invisible with the total commitment of children who had nowhere else to be. Hazel waited. The first sign that something was happening came at mid-morning. She heard it before she saw it. A change in the character of the street noise outside. A gathering of voices that had the particular excited, uncertain quality of people who'd encountered unexpected news and were testing it against each other. She went to the window and saw a small cluster of people outside the general store, and then another cluster forming near the post office. And someone, she couldn't see who from this angle, moving fast down the main street in the direction of the sheriff's office. She stayed at the window. 20 minutes later, she saw Tom Pryor ride in from the North Road, and he rode with the set of a man who had seen something significant and was going to tell someone about it immediately. 30 minutes after that, Colt came through her back door. She turned from the window before he spoke. "They found it," he said. "All of it. The cattle, the building, the records, everything we saw, plus more. Connolly had 3 deputies and they went in at first light. The guard at the camp, same man we saw, didn't resist apparently, just put his hands up and sat down." She exhaled. "The records in the building," Colt continued. He was talking quickly, the words coming out with the compressed energy of a man who'd been holding them in for the last hour. "There were more than what I'd seen. More letters, more ledgers, buyer names, dates going back 18 months. Numbers that are... Hazel, it's bigger than we thought. It wasn't just the ranches in this valley. He was moving cattle from 3 counties. She sat down on the stool. Not from weakness, just because standing was taking up energy she needed for thinking. "And Hale himself," she said. "Connolly went to the Hale property directly after the canyon," he paused, "with 2 deputies and the warrant." She looked up. "And?" "Hale answered the door himself. Connolly told me he looked..." Colt stopped, choosing the word carefully. "Unsurprised, like a man who'd known it was coming and had been waiting for it to arrive and was now dealing with it in the way you deal with a storm you can't stop, by deciding how to stand." "What did he say?" "Nothing. He asked for his lawyer. He was polite about it." Colt shook his head slightly. Not admiration exactly, but the reluctant acknowledgement of a particular kind of nerve. Connolly said it was the most controlled he'd ever seen a man under those circumstances. "He's had 30 years of practice," Hazel said. "Men like that don't lose control in front of witnesses. They lose it privately, and then they rebuild." Colt looked at her. "Do you think he can get out of it?" She thought honestly about that. Not about what she wanted, but about what was actually likely. The documents were real. Garrett's testimony was coming. The cattle were in the canyon with modified brands that a competent examination would unravel. The buyers across the state line were recorded names and amounts. It was not a small thing that could be explained away or attributed to confusion. "Not entirely," she said. "He'll fight it. He has money and he'll spend it. The trial, if it comes to trial, will be long and complicated and unpleasant." She met Colt's eyes. "But he won't walk away clean. The days of Victor Hale being untouchable in this valley are over." He was quiet for a moment. Then Garrett came in. She looked up. "He was at the sheriff's office when I left, sitting across from Connolly with his hat in his hands, giving his statement." Something crossed Colt's face. Not quite respect, not quite something else. the specific human acknowledgement of a person doing a hard, necessary thing. He looked like a man who'd put down something he'd been carrying for a very long time. Good, she said, and she meant it for Garrett as much as for the outcome. Check. The afternoon brought a different kind of noise. Black Ridge processed information the way all small communities processed it, in rapid overlapping waves, each wave carrying a version of the story that was partly accurate and partly shaped by who was telling it and what they needed it to mean. By noon, the basic facts had propagated. The sheriff had raided a canyon north of town, found stolen cattle, made arrests. Victor Hale was under investigation. Marcus Webb had been brought in for questioning. By 2 in the afternoon, the elaborations had started. The cattle count grew in the telling. The arrests multiplied. Someone said Victor Hale had been taken out of his house in handcuffs, which was not what had happened, but which traveled faster than the accurate version because it was more satisfying. Hazel heard all of this through the standard channels. Customers who came in and talked, voices from the street. The particular energized quality of a town where something had shifted and everyone was recalibrating. She listened and kept working and said very little, which was her established register in this community and attracted no special notice. What she noticed was different from what most of the town noticed. She noticed who came in that afternoon with a specific kind of wariness. People who had been associated with Hale in various ways, who were now trying to read the room and determine what this meant for them. She noticed which conversations stopped when they saw her, which was not unusual in itself, but was happening for different reasons now. Before, the conversations had stopped because she wasn't worth including. Now, she thought, some of them were stopping because people were revising what they knew about her and hadn't finished that revision yet. She noticed Joanna Birch, who came in at 3 with a smile that was small and genuine and didn't make a speech of itself. I heard Tom Pryor said something at the sheriff's office this morning, Joanna said. She was looking at a bolt of fabric with the focus of a woman who was not particularly interested in the fabric. About how the investigation got started. Hazel kept working. What did he say? That someone had been watching the pattern of the thefts for weeks, putting pieces together that nobody else bothered to look at. Joanna glanced at her sideways. That particular sideways glance that women use when they're saying something they've decided to commit to, but want to gauge the landing before the full weight arrives. He didn't say who. Hazel said. Joanna set the fabric down. I want 2 yards of that gray wool, she said, when you have time. It was the most either of them said about it, which was the right amount. Colt came back at 6, after the Deputy Aldous had been released from his post. There was no need now for that particular arrangement, the danger having shifted from the threat of individual action to the slower, more formal danger of courts and testimony and legal maneuvering. He came through the front this time, because the front no longer required the same calculation. The shop was quiet. Late afternoon light came through the window at a long angle, catching the dust in the air and making it visible, all that suspended ordinary particulate that was always there and usually invisible. Hazel was at the work table finishing the coat that had been waiting since Tuesday. He sat on the stool. He put his hat on the table. He looked at her working for a moment in the way he looked at things he was trying to accurately assess, without rushing the assessment, without deciding what he was seeing before he'd properly seen it. How are you? He said. She looked up at him. The question was not a formality. He didn't use formalities, and she treated it accordingly. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I think there's a part of this that hasn't landed. It's been building for 6 weeks, and now the action is done, and I'm still running on the urgency of it. She looked back at the coat. Ask me tomorrow. Fair enough. She finished a seam and smoothed it flat with her thumb. What happens now with Connolly? He's keeping Webb in for questioning tonight. Webb's smarter than the guard at the camp. He knows what he knows, and he knows what it's worth, and he'll try to use it. Connolly said he expects Webb to talk by tomorrow because a man in Webb's position will do the math on loyalty and self-preservation wins. What about the buyers across the state line? Connolly is contacting the county sheriff there. That's a bigger jurisdiction, more complicated. He turned his hat in his hands. His version of the same thing Garrett had done with the jar of water, she noticed. The handling of an object while the mind worked. It'll take time. These things take time. She nodded. The ranchers are meeting Monday, he said, to talk about what recovery looks like. How many of the cattle can be identified and returned, what the losses are that can't be recovered, whether there's a case for damages through the courts. He looked at her. You should come. She set the needle down. They won't want me there. Tom Pryor will. He said so this morning. He met her eyes steadily. Sanderson doesn't know who to thank yet, but he'll figure it out. Grady is complicated. He's a proud man, and he'll take some time to get around to it. A beat. But the meeting is about the recovery, and you know as much about the shape of what happened as anyone in the valley. Your notebook. My notebook stays where it is unless a court needs it, she said. Then come without the notebook. Come as a person who understands the situation. He was not asking the way men sometimes ask things that were actually instructions. He was genuinely asking. You've been invisible in this town for 4 years. That's done now, whether you chose it or not. You can either walk into that new situation on your own terms or let it happen around you. She looked at the coat in her hands. It was nearly finished. Another hour, maybe less. There was a satisfaction in a finished thing. The knowledge that the work had been done correctly, that the pieces held together the way they were supposed to, that what had been broken was now repaired and the repair would hold. She thought about 4 years of edges, 4 years of being the background of other people's stories. What time is the meeting? She said. Something in his face, she'd been watching his face long enough now to catch the small things, shifted in the way it shifted when something pleased him that he wasn't going to make a performance of. 9 in the morning, he said, at the Pryor place. I'll be there at 9, she said. Sunday was a day without event, which she hadn't entirely expected. She thought there would be more noise, more visible fallout, some confrontation or complication that she'd need to navigate. But Black Ridge, having received the shock, settled into a strange quiet. The Silverhorn was louder than usual Saturday night, which was the community processing things in its own way. And Sunday morning, the main street was subdued in the way streets are subdued when people are doing their internal accounting before resuming their external presentations. 2 customers came in. One was a woman Hazel barely knew whose husband worked a small ranch on the south edge of the valley. She'd come for a button repair and said nothing about anything, which was comfortable. The other was Douglas Weston. She hadn't expected Douglas Weston. He was a tall man, 60 or so, with the particular bearing of a man who had been wealthy and respected long enough that it had become structural, built into his posture, into the way he occupied a room, into the mild, perpetual expectation that the space he was in would accommodate him. He had always looked at Hazel, on the rare occasions he'd been forced to acknowledge her existence, with the absent dismissiveness of a man looking at something that didn't require a full assessment. He looked at her differently now. She registered this without making anything of it in her face. She set down her work and stood. Mr. Weston, she said. Miss Rowan. He held his hat. He was not comfortable, which was interesting. A man like Douglas Weston was almost never visibly uncomfortable, having had too many decades of practice at presenting certainty in all conditions. I'll be brief. I have a suit that needs adjusting, the waistcoat particularly. I've been meaning to bring it in. She kept her expression even. The suit was a pretext. A man like Weston had a tailor in the county seat he'd been using for 20 years, and they both knew it. But she was a practical woman, and pretext served their purpose. I can have it done by Wednesday, she said. He nodded. He didn't immediately leave, which was the tell. A man who'd come only for the suit would have left. I understand, he said finally, that the investigation into Hale's operation began with observation of a specific nature, by someone with a specific eye for patterns. She said nothing. She looked at him and waited. I was told this by Tom Pryor, he continued, who was told by Connolly, who apparently has more information about the origin of this investigation than he initially indicated. He cleared his throat. What I'm saying, Miss Rowan, is that it seems I and others may have had an incomplete picture of the extent of your... He stopped. She waited. She was going to make him finish the sentence. He looked at her directly for the first time in 4 years. We were not paying proper attention, he said. It was as close to an apology as Douglas Weston likely came, and she could see the effort in it. The small structural adjustment required in a man who had spent 60 years believing his assessments of people were accurate. No, she said, without softening it particularly. You weren't. He received that. He put his hat back on. I'll have the suit here Monday, he said. Wednesday, she said. I have a meeting Monday morning. He nodded once more and left, and she stood for a moment in the empty shop and thought about the strange, imperfect, very human texture of the thing that had just happened. Not a conversion, not a revelation, just a man making the smallest possible correction to a very large error, because that was what men like Douglas Weston were capable of, and because even the smallest correction was better than none. Monday morning at the Pryor Ranch was not what she'd expected, and she'd learned to expect the unexpected. She rode Soot out to the Pryor place, arriving at 9:05 because she'd stopped to add a final entry to her notebook before leaving, and walked into a room with 9 ranchers in it that went briefly quiet in the specific way rooms went quiet when someone entered who altered the expected composition. Tom Pryor crossed the room and shook her hand, which visibly surprised several people and visibly surprised nobody more than Tom Pryor himself, who seemed to have decided to do it before fully thinking through the social calculus and had committed anyway, which she respected. Miss Rowan, he said, glad you came. Colt was on the other side of the room. He caught her eye and didn't do anything particular. No signal, no nod, just the acknowledgement of her presence in the room as a fact that required no additional management. She appreciated that more than any gesture would have accounted for. She sat. The meeting started. What she did for the next 2 hours was not dramatic. There was no moment of revelation, no speech that changed the temperature of the room. What she did was answer questions when she had the relevant information, ask questions when she didn't, and twice. Once, when the conversation went in a direction that was factually wrong about the timeline of events, and once when 2 ranchers began arguing about something that was less important than what they were avoiding, say, quietly and without apology, the thing that needed to be said. Both times, the room listened. She noticed this. She filed it carefully, not with triumph, but with the particular attention she brought to things that represented new information about how the world was organized. By the end of the meeting, the shape of the recovery was roughed out. 41 of the 43 cattle in the canyon had been matched to specific brands, with documentation. The legal process around damages was complicated, but not hopeless. Connolly had confirmed that Webb had broken overnight, had given a statement that Garrett's testimony corroborated in specific and damning detail. Victor Hale, who had spent 30 years as the most powerful man in the valley, was facing the remainder of his life in a legal struggle that his money might extend but could not resolve in his favor. The man who had once controlled Black Ridge had, in the space of a weekend, lost the most important thing he owned. Not the land, not the cattle, not the buildings with his name on the dedications. The thing he'd lost was the certainty that no one would look closely enough to see what was actually there. Someone had looked. Walking out after the meeting, Hazel was stopped by Cal Grady. He was a proud man, as Colt had said, the particular pride of someone who'd built everything himself and carried that building as proof of something he needed to keep proving. He had not spoken directly to her during the meeting. She hadn't expected him to. He stopped her near the door with a hand briefly on her arm, which he removed immediately, as though he'd surprised himself with the contact. I'll be honest with you, he said. He said it like a man who considered honesty a specific effort rather than a default. I don't know what to make of all this. That's reasonable, she said. Tom says you had this figured out weeks ago, that you'd been building it since before anyone else knew what to look at. He met her eyes, and his were the complicated eyes of a man who held 2 contradictory things at once and knew it. I lost 22 head. That's a year of work for me, near enough. I know, she said. I'm sorry for that. He looked at her for a moment. Why did you do it? He asked. It was a genuine question, not a challenge. The question of a man who needed to understand the motivation because he was accustomed to assuming he knew what drove people and had found out he'd been wrong. She thought about how to answer that honestly without making it either modest or large. Because I saw something wrong, she said, and I couldn't unfeel it once I'd seen it. She paused. And because nobody else was looking in the right direction. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. A single, slow nod, the kind that indicated processing rather than agreement or disagreement. Well, he said, thank you for it. He walked away before she could respond, which was probably just as well, because she hadn't decided what to say. Colt fell into step beside her on the way to where they'd left their horses. The morning was warming up the way August mornings did, the early coolness giving way to a heat that was going to be comprehensive and ungentle by noon. The drought hadn't broken. Whatever else had changed in the valley in the last 3 days, the sky remained clear and uncompromising, and the ground remained hard. "That went better than I expected," he said. "It went about as well as it could have," she said. "Grady will come around. Some of the others will take longer. Weston came to the shop yesterday." He glanced at her. "What did he want?" "He brought a suit." She paused. "And he told me he hadn't been paying proper attention." He took that in. He let a few steps go by before he spoke. "What did you say?" "I told him he was right," she said. "And I told him I'd have his suit done by Wednesday." He looked sideways at her. That look she'd come to know that meant he found something specifically, quietly, right about what she'd done. "You didn't let him off the hook," he said. "He didn't earn being let off the hook," she said. "He earned being told the truth and given the opportunity to be better." They reached the horses. She put her foot in the stirrup and swung up onto Soot, who shifted her weight and settled, patient as always. Colt stood with his hand on his horse's neck and looked up at her with an expression that had something layered in it. The immediate thing, which was the conversation they were having, and something longer range and less immediately resolved that had been building for months. "What do you want?" he said. "Not what's next. Not what should we do. What do you want?" She looked at the prior property behind them, the house and the barn and the ranch yard going about its morning business, ordinary and specific. She looked at the road that led back to town. She looked at the blue hard sky above the northern ridge, where a canyon held the scattered aftermath of a thing that had been wrong for too long. "I want the drought to break," she said. Because that was true. It was the most immediate true thing, and it was the kind of answer that didn't overreach, that kept its feet on the ground. He almost smiled. Not quite. "What else?" She looked at him. She had spent 4 years being practical to the exclusion of almost everything that practicality excluded, because she'd needed to, because survival had required it, because the edges were a place where you didn't get to want things that weren't immediately achievable. She was not at the edges anymore. She wasn't sure where she was exactly, but it wasn't there. "I want people to stop being surprised when I have something worth saying," she said. "I want a shop that isn't barely surviving. I want—" She stopped, reconsidered, said the smaller, truer version. "I want this valley to be a place where what you build matters more than where you started." He looked at her for a long moment. "That's a lot to want," he said. "I know," she said. "I've had it stored up." He put his foot in the stirrup. "Then let's see about getting you some of it," he said, simply and without ceremony, in the way of a man who treated other people's wants as things worth taking seriously. They rode back toward Black Ridge in the morning heat, through the dry grass and the hard light, and behind them Tom Pryor's ranch yard continued its work, and ahead of them the town waited with its imperfect ongoing life, the conversation still unfinished, the prejudices still only partially corrected, the arrangements of power still settling into their new configurations like a structure after a shift in the ground. Nothing was resolved cleanly, nothing was going to be. But the canyon was empty now, and the records were in Connolly's hands, and Roy Garrett had put down what he'd been carrying, and 41 ranchers' cattle were on their way home. And Hazel Rowan, riding a small bay mare through the August heat on the road back to the town that had spent 4 years not seeing her, held herself with the particular straightness of a woman who had decided, quietly and without announcement, that she was done with the edges. The rain came on a Wednesday. Not dramatically, no building storm, no theatrical lightning on the ridge. It simply began sometime in the early hours of a Wednesday morning in the 3rd week of September, as a sound on the roof of Hazel's shop that she lay listening to for several minutes before she understood what it was. She had grown so accustomed to the silence of drought, to the dry, particular weight of nights that offered nothing, that the sound didn't resolve into its correct meaning immediately. It was just sound, unfamiliar, against the wood above her. Then it did resolve, and she lay still for another long moment, listening to it properly. Rain. Actual rain, steady and unhurried, the kind that soaked rather than ran, the kind the valley had been needing for 3 months. She got up and went to the back door and opened it and stood in the doorway with her feet on the dry threshold and let the rain touch her face. It was cold. The smell of it was extraordinary. The specific smell of water hitting dry earth, which is unlike any other smell in the world, which carries in it something that isn't quite relief and isn't quite grief, but holds both of them and is larger than either. She stood there until she was properly wet, and then she went back inside and made coffee and sat at the work table in the dark with the rain on the roof and felt, for the first time in a long time, that the ground under her was solid, not resolved, not finished, but solid. The weeks between the canyon raid and the rain had been the strangest of her 4 years in Black Ridge, which was saying something, because none of those years had been ordinary. The legal proceedings had begun with the slow, grinding formality of systems that were designed more to survive challenges than to move quickly. Victor Hale had, as she'd predicted, engaged lawyers, 2 of them, brought in from outside the county, men whose manners suggested they had spent their careers making complicated situations manageable for men with money. They filed motions. They challenged the grounds of the search. They questioned the credibility of Roy Garrett, whose past association with the operation, they argued, made him an unreliable witness with self-interested motivations. None of this surprised Hazel. She had expected it and had said so. Early, when Colt had come in one Thursday looking tighter in the jaw than usual, with a newspaper that contained a story about Hale's legal team and their stated intention to fight every element of the case. "This is how it works," she told him then, without particular bitterness. "A man with that much money doesn't lose quickly. He loses slowly, if he loses, and he makes everyone involved in losing him pay for the privilege. It could drag on for years," he said. "Parts of it will," she said. "The criminal portion is the clearest. The records, the brands, Garrett's testimony, Webb's statement. That's a case a jury can understand, but Hale will draw out everything adjacent to it as long as he can." She'd looked at him steadily. "That doesn't mean he wins. It means winning takes longer than we'd like." What she hadn't fully anticipated was the speed at which the community itself moved, independent of the courts. The courts were slow. People were not. Within a week of the canyon raid, the shape of Black Ridge had begun to change in ways that were small enough individually and significant enough collectively. 2 of the merchant families who had been visibly aligned with Hale's interests, who had extended him credit and praise in equal measure for years, began creating distance. The particular careful social distance that people create when they realize they have been proximate to something that is about to fall. It wasn't noble, it was self-preserving, but the effect, whatever the motivation, was that Victor Hale's name stopped being invoked the way it had always been invoked, as a weight on one side of any scale that automatically tipped the balance. Without that weight, other things could be weighed fairly. Hazel noticed this in the small ways she noticed everything. The customer who came in who hadn't come in before, the conversation at the dry goods store that included her rather than stopping when she arrived, the meeting of ranchers where a question was directed at her and the room waited for her answer with the attention of people who expected the answer to be worth hearing. None of it was clean. None of it was the wholehearted correction that justice in its ideal form would have looked like. Marta Cleave still had a way of looking at her that hadn't entirely shed its old assumptions. There were people in that valley who would never fully revise what they'd decided about Hazel Rowan, because human beings are not well built for revising fundamental assessments, and most of them don't even try. But enough had changed, enough that the quality of her days was different in ways that were not dramatic enough to describe and were real enough to matter. Marcus Webb's testimony, delivered in a formal statement 3 weeks after his arrest, confirmed and expanded what Garrett had already provided. Webb was not a man with Garrett's conscience. He testified because the math was clear and because the alternative was carrying the whole weight of the conspiracy on his own back while Victor Hale's lawyers worked to position him as the primary architect. He was thorough because thoroughness served him, and what his thoroughness produced was a picture of the operation that was more complete than even Hazel's notebook had assembled. 18 months, 3 counties, 11 buyers across the state line, most of them operating in the loose regulatory territory that existed beyond the closer jurisdictions. Somewhere in the range of 240 cattle, total, moved through the canyon or similar holding points and sold at prices that had made the operation not a side enterprise, but a significant revenue stream, enough that it had funded improvements to the Hale main property, a legal expansion of grazing rights in the Eastern Valley, and the particular generosity to community institutions that had kept Victor Hale's reputation above suspicion for the duration. That last detail was the one that the town found hardest to process. Not the theft itself. Theft was comprehensible. Even large-scale organized theft had a shape the mind could manage. What was harder was the specific way the stolen money had been laundered back into respectability, used to build the very civic goodwill that had made Hale untouchable. The donations to the church fund, the contribution toward the new schoolhouse roof, the support for the community well project during the previous year's dry spell. Colt sat across from her in the shop on the afternoon the full picture became known, and he looked like a man dealing with the particular nausea that comes from realizing that something you'd trusted had been hollow. The well project, he said. He donated to the well project during the drought. Yes, she said. He was stealing cattle from ranchers who were already struggling with the drought and then donating part of the money to a well project that would help the same people get through the drought. Yes. She looked at him. It's a particular kind of intelligence, what he had. The ability to see what people needed and give it to them in a form that made it impossible to question him. She paused. That's the thing about that kind of man. He wasn't wrong about what the town needed. He just used that knowledge to make himself immune while he took what he wanted. Colt was quiet for a long moment. Does that make it worse? He said. I think it makes it more honest, actually, she said, about how that kind of power works. It doesn't work by being monstrous. It works by being useful enough, often enough, that people decide the questions they could ask aren't worth asking. She met his eyes. The lesson isn't that charitable men are secretly corrupt. The lesson is to keep asking the questions even when you like the answers you've been getting. He turned his hat in his hands, that familiar motion, and looked at her with the specific expression he had when she'd said something he was going to keep. You should write that down, he said. I write everything down, she said. The trial, when it formally began 6 weeks later, was held at the county seat and lasted longer than most people's patience. Hazel did not attend every day. She had a shop to run, customers who had begun returning in numbers that made the back room workable rather than merely survivable, and a practical understanding that she did not need to witness every procedural motion to know how the story was going to end. She went for Roy Garrett's testimony. He sat in that witness chair like a man who had decided once and finally what kind of person he was going to be in the last portion of his life and was prepared to pay whatever the decision cost. He was not smooth. He stumbled over a date once and had to be corrected by his own notes. Hale's lawyers pushed him on his own knowledge of and participation in the operation, and he answered them directly. Yes, I knew. No, I did not report it. Yes, I understood what I was allowing to continue. He did not try to minimize himself into innocence. He sat in the weight of what he'd done and what he'd failed to do, and he answered every question and he kept his eyes level. It was one of the most honest things Hazel had ever seen a person do in a public setting, and it was not comfortable to watch, and it was not designed to be comfortable. It was just true, in the way that full truth is never entirely comfortable because it doesn't arrange itself for the audience's ease. Afterward, in the corridor outside the courtroom, she found him standing near a window with a cup of water he wasn't drinking. Mr. Garrett, she said. He looked at her. He knew who she was. Colt had introduced them, briefly, in the weeks before the trial. Miss Rowan. She wasn't sure, standing there, exactly what she'd meant to say. She'd followed some instinct to find him and hadn't fully thought past the finding. What you did in there, she said. The honesty of it. Not the convenient parts. All of it. He looked at the window. The county seat was a larger town than Black Ridge, with a different quality of street noise. More traffic, more crowded, more of the compressed energy of a place that had more competing interests than the valley had. I kept those documents for 8 months, he said. Told myself it was self-protection. A pause. I think I knew I was going to use them someday. I just didn't know how to get to the place where I was willing to pay what it cost. What changed? She asked. Not because she didn't have a theory, but because she wanted to hear him say it. Someone came to my porch and told me the necessary time was now, he said. He almost smiled. Not quite, but close. Hard to argue with that, once you've heard it plainly. She thought about Colt, riding out to Ridgeway on a Friday morning with a cover story about land he wasn't going to buy, sitting on a mismatched porch chair and telling a worn-down man that carrying a thing and setting it down were both his to choose, but that one of them had a deadline. "I'm glad he went," she said. "So am I," Garrett said. He finally drank from the cup. "For what it's worth, Miss Rowan, Colt Mercer talks about you the way a man talks about someone who changed the direction of his life. He doesn't say it that way, but it's there." She stood with that for a moment in the corridor of the county courthouse, with the noise of the larger town outside and the trial of Victor Hale in the room behind them. "The direction was already going somewhere honest," she said. "I just helped him see what he was already looking at." The verdict came in on a Thursday, which she'd note later was the day of the week that had always mattered most in her life in Black Ridge. The day Colt had first come back without a real reason, the day things had been settled and resettled, the day the rhythm of something real had established itself between two people who had both needed to be seen and had found that, between them, they were capable of the seeing. Victor Hale was found guilty on 7 counts, which was not all of what he'd been charged with, and was more than his lawyers had predicted they could prevent. The criminal conviction carried a sentence that his age and his lawyers and the particular mercy of the justice system would probably compress at the edges, but that would not return him to anything resembling his former life. His properties, the main ranch, the eastern grazing leases, the buildings in town with his name on the dedication plaques, were subject to civil proceedings that would take years to fully resolve, and would, by all reasonable estimation, strip the wealth he'd built down past the point where rebuilding was possible. The man who had controlled Black Ridge for 30 years did not make a scene when the verdict was read. He sat with the same controlled stillness that Connolly had described on the morning the warrant was served. He thanked his lawyers, which was either dignity or habit, or some mix of the two that had become indistinguishable in a man who had spent 6 decades presenting a version of himself to the world that bore a complicated relationship to what was actually inside. Hazel did not feel triumph when she heard the verdict. She noted this about herself with the same honest attention she brought to everything. What she felt was something quieter. The particular feeling of a weight being correctly distributed, not lifted entirely, because the losses were real and the years were real, and 41 head of returned cattle could not fully account for the months of anxiety and the operations that had been stressed past their capacity. But distributed correctly, put where it actually belonged, which was on the person who had made it rather than on the people who had been made to carry it. Justice, she had decided over the preceding months, was not a feeling. It was a process that sometimes arrived at approximately correct conclusions if enough people refused to look in the wrong direction and at least a few people were willing to pay the cost of looking in the right one. It was not satisfying in the clean way that stories about it tended to suggest. It was satisfying in the way that difficult, necessary work was satisfying. The way a complex alteration was satisfying when you finished it, not because it had been easy, but because it had been done correctly and would hold. She and Colt drove back to Black Ridge that evening in his wagon because she'd come to the county seat on Soot, and he'd offered the wagon as having more room, and she'd accepted because the day had been long and she was tired in a way that didn't have anything wrong with it, just the honest tiredness of a day that had mattered. The road back ran through the low hills between the county seat and the valley, and the evening light came in sideways and gold across the dry grass, which was not green yet but was beginning to show, here and there, the faint indication of response to the week of intermittent rain. They didn't talk immediately. The silence between them had never needed filling, and it didn't need it now. Then Colt said, not looking at her, looking at the road, "What do you want to do with the shop?" She looked at him. It was a specific question, not vague, not rhetorical. He meant, given that everything has changed, given that you are no longer who the town thought you were, given that the ground is different, what do you actually want to do with your life? "Expand it," she said. "There's a room at the back of the building that the landlord uses for storage. He's mentioned before that he'd rent it." She'd been thinking about this for weeks, in the careful, practical way she thought about things that she wanted but hadn't let herself want fully until the ground was stable enough to build on. "I want to take on more complex work, proper tailoring, not just mending. There are women in this valley who've been going to the county seat for anything beyond basic alterations because nobody here could do it." He nodded slowly. "That's a real business," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm capable of running a real business." "I know you are," he said without emphasis, because he'd known it for a long time and it didn't require emphasis. She looked at the road. The hills on either side were dark and soft in the evening light, and the valley was opening up ahead of them, the wide flat of it, the ridge to the north, the scatter of ranch lights coming on as the dark arrived. "What about you?" she said. "What do you want?" He was quiet for a moment in the way he was quiet when he was going to say something true rather than something easy. "I want to stop doing things that don't matter to me because they're what's expected," he said. "I've spent 15 years building a ranch and most of that was right. It's good land, I worked it correctly, but some of it was performing what a successful man in this valley is supposed to look like." He paused. "I'd like to stop performing and just be it." She looked at him. The wagon moved through the evening and the horse was steady on the familiar road. "You've been doing more of the real thing than you give yourself credit for," she said. "Maybe." He glanced at her sideways. "You've made it easier to see the difference." She didn't say anything to that, because some things land more cleanly in silence, and she'd always known how to let a silence hold what needed to be held. They rode into Black Ridge as the last light left the sky, and the town was ordinary around them. The silver horn beginning its evening, a lamp in the post office window, the dry goods store locked and dark. She looked at it with the eye of someone seeing a familiar place from a slightly different angle, which was what it was. She had been in this town for 4 years, and it was the same town, but she was standing in it differently, and that changed what was visible from where she stood. Colt stopped the wagon in front of her shop, and she climbed down, and he handed down her bag, and they stood for a moment in front of the narrow building with the slightly uneven letters on the sign. The R still bigger than the rest, the way it had always been, the way she'd painted it on the first day because she'd been nervous, and the brush had been slightly too full. "Thursday?" he said. He meant, "Will you be here? Will we still have this? Is this still the shape of things?" "Thursday," she said. Which meant, yes, all of those things. He nodded once. He got back on the wagon and clicked the horse forward, and she watched him go down the main street, which she had watched him go down dozens of times, in the direction of his ranch and his land and his real life. She went inside and lit the lamp and stood in the familiar smell of the shop, fabric and oil, and the particular dry wood smell of an old building that had been lived in, and felt the particular, unspectacular weight of a life that had changed and was still changing and was not going to resolve into something simple. There's a thing that people in small towns say about their community, usually when they're trying to explain it to someone from outside, that everyone knows everyone, and what they mean by that, usually, is not that everyone knows everyone. They mean that everyone knows a version of everyone, the version that the town has agreed upon, the version that takes up the right amount of space and doesn't require the community to revise its understanding or expand its attention. What happened in Black Ridge after Victor Hale was a revision. Not a comfortable one. Revisions rarely are. The people who had been certain about things, about who mattered and who didn't, about which arrangements of power were natural versus constructed, about whose intelligence was worth investing attention in, those people had to do the work of reconsidering, and most of them did some of it and skipped some of it and told themselves they'd done more than they had. That's how people work. The total revision, the full-scale moral overhaul, is a story we tell. What actually happens is people make some corrections, skip others, and gradually the aggregate shifts enough that the world is slightly more honest than it was. Hazel did not expect to be loved by this town. She had not expected that before, and she did not expect it after. What she had wanted was what she'd told Colt on the road back from the prior ranch, a place where what you build matters more than where you started. She was building toward that. It was not guaranteed and it was not complete, but the direction was right, and she'd learned, in 4 years of edges and 6 weeks of danger and all the time before that, in the longer history she carried and had never discussed with anyone in Black Ridge, she'd learned that direction mattered more than destination, because destinations kept receding and the direction was the thing you could actually control. The drought broke completely in October. It rained for 4 days in a row, steady and real. And the creek at the south edge of Colt's property came up 8 inches, and the grass began to come back, and the ranchers in the valley started doing the math on recovery with a kind of cautious relief that wasn't celebration and wasn't despair, but was the honest middle ground of people who had been through something and knew better than to assume the future was guaranteed. Cal Grady stopped by the shop one afternoon in November. He came in without a pretext. No garment, no repair. He sat on the customer's chair near the door that wasn't the stool, because the stool had become, by some unspoken arrangement, Colt's, and Grady seemed to understand this without being told. "I've been thinking," he said, which was how he started things, Hazel had come to learn, "about the meeting, the Monday meeting, after all of it." "What about it?" she said. "You said something about the valley being a place where what you build matters more than where you started." He looked at the work table, at her hands on the fabric. "I've been trying to figure out if I believe that." She looked up at him. "And? I think I'm working on it," he said. He said it with the bluntness of a man who had decided that approximate honesty was the best he could manage and had made a kind of peace with that. "I think some people are going to take a long time to get there, myself included." "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying to be." He stood up, having said what he came to say, which was apparently enough. "Good work on that coat, by the way. Weston told me you turned it around in 2 days." "It was straightforward work," she said. "He didn't think it was straightforward," Grady said. "He's been telling people about it." A pause at the door. "Just so you know." He left, and she sat with the strange, imperfect, very ordinary process of a man trying to be slightly better than he'd been, and thought that this was probably what community actually looked like when you got close enough to see the texture of it. Not the grand correction, not the moment of collective realization, just person after person doing the small, uncomfortable work of being slightly less wrong than they were before. It wasn't enough. It was what there was. And sometimes what there was turned out to be more than you'd thought, if you kept showing up to find out. Colt came in on a Thursday in December, which was cold now, a real winter cold that had come down off the ridge and settled into the valley for the season. She'd gotten the back room from the landlord in October, and the shop was twice the size it had been, with a second work table and room for the kind of work she'd been turning away for years. 2 women from the western ranches had become regular clients. A woman in town had asked her to make a dress for a daughter's wedding, which was the kind of work that would have gone to the county seat before and hadn't, and that fact was not lost on Hazel. He came in and sat on the stool, and she poured him coffee without being asked, because she'd been doing that for long enough that it had become its own habit, the kind of habit that accumulates without decision and turns out, on examination, to be the shape of something. "I heard from Connolly this morning," he said, "about the civil proceedings." She looked up. "Hale's Eastern grazing leases," he said. "They're going to be broken up, sold off to cover damages." He turned the cup in his hands. "There's land there that would work for a smaller operation, someone who wanted to run things honestly and build it up at a realistic pace." She kept her eyes on him. "Are you thinking about it?" "I've been thinking about it," he said. "It's not a sure thing. There are other buyers, and it's more land than I strictly need, which means carrying costs for a few years while it develops." He looked at her. "But it's good land. Hale didn't lie about that. The land was always good." "The problem was never the land," she said. "No," he said. It wasn't. They sat with that for a moment. Outside, the December wind moved down the main street, and someone's sign creaked on its bracket, and 2 horses at the rail stamped against the cold. She was going to say something practical, about the financing, the timeline, the specific risks of acquiring land in the middle of ongoing civil proceedings. She had thought about those things. She was always going to think about those things, because that was who she was, and she'd made her peace with it. But what she said instead was, "It's good land, and you'd work it right." He looked at her. His eyes were the same as they'd been the first day, unhurried, assessing, not deciding what they were seeing before they'd properly seen it. "You'd have to come and look at it," he said. "Tell me what you think." "I'm not a land person," she said. "No," he agreed. "But you're the person I trust to tell me whether something I'm looking at is as solid as I think it is." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she looked back at the work in front of her, the good clean work of a dress that a woman would wear on the day her daughter got married, each stitch placed where it needed to be. "Saturday," she said. "I can go Saturday." He nodded. He drank the coffee. He stayed for a while the way he stayed without requiring the time to justify itself. And the lamp burned steadily, and the wind moved outside, and the shop was warm and full of the smell of work being done right. This was not the ending of anything. That was the thing about real life. It didn't end, it just changed shape, became the next thing, carried you forward into the ongoing complicated fact of itself. The trial would continue to wind through its final motions. Garrett would keep his small place near Ridgeway, and build it slowly towards something. Roy Garrett, Hazel thought, was going to be all right, not because the world had become easier for him, but because he'd found out what he was made of when it mattered, and had decided he could live with what he'd found. That was not nothing. Webb would receive his reduced sentence and would leave Black Ridge eventually and not come back, which was a resolution of a kind. The buyers across the state line were mostly caught, and some would face their own proceedings and some would not, because that was the reality of jurisdiction and distance and the limits of what a single county's sheriff could chase. The valley would recover. Not all the way and not all at once, but the grass was coming back, and the creek was running, and the ranchers were making cautious plans, and the specific hard year of drought and theft would scar the ledgers of several operations for a long time and would fade from those ledgers. Eventually, the way hard years always faded, not forgotten, but absorbed into the larger history of a place that had survived things before and expected to survive things again. And in the narrow shop on the main street of Black Ridge, no longer quite so narrow now, with the back room open and the second table and the growing list of customers who came because the work was good and because the woman who did it had proven herself to be worth knowing. Hazel Rowan worked, and the needle moved, and the stitches held. She had not become beloved. She had not been transformed into the heroine of a story that the town told to feel good about itself. She had become, more simply and more permanently, a person who could not be overlooked. Not because she'd made herself impossible to ignore, but because she had been right when it mattered, and the rightness had been witnessed. And witnessed things leave marks that eventually become part of what a place remembers about itself. That was enough. It was, she had concluded, what enough looked like in practice. Not perfect, not complete, not the version she might have written if she'd been writing it from outside. Just the solid, imperfect reality of a life that had found its ground and was building on it, one day at a time, with all the patience and all the precision that the work required. She set a stitch, and then another, and the lamp burned warm against the winter dark. And outside the window, Black Ridge went about the ordinary business of being a place where people lived and worked and made their mistakes, and sometimes, not often enough, but sometimes, looked up from what they'd always assumed and saw something true.